Chapter 12 of The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn by Harry Collingwood. Chapter 12. Islands of Fire. We had by this time been on the group 8 months, and although, with brief intervals spent in visits to the wreck, a sharp lookout for the appearance of a sail in the offing had been maintained, nothing had been sighted, and the disconcerting possibility now began to impress itself upon me that if I continued to trust only to such an occurrence for our deliverance, we might spend years waiting for that event. Most fortunately, we had both thus far been blessed with perfect health, but it seemed too much to expect that this immunity from sickness or accident should continue indefinitely, and if both of us should chance to fall sick at the same time, what would be the result? Something very like panic seized me at the thought of such a possibility. I felt that I had been culpably foolish in relying so implicitly and for so long a time upon extraneous help, and the conviction forced itself upon me that I must, at once, take steps to effect our own deliverance. Yet what could I do? The first idea that had suggested itself to me after the wreck of the brigantine was to build some sort of a craft in which we could effect our escape to civilization. But after considering the matter, I had come to the conclusion that such an undertaking would be altogether beyond my powers, with only Billy to assist me. No doubt I was helped to this conclusion by the conviction I then felt that something would certainly heave in sight within the next month or two to take us off. But with the lapse of time my confidence had insensibly waned, and I had, accordingly, set to work to make our stay upon the group as comfortable as might be. Now, however, I felt constrained to reconsider my original conclusion, and as a preliminary I took pencil and paper, drawing instruments and scale, and proceeded to make tentative sketches of such a craft as I considered essential to enable us to make the voyage in safety, and with a reasonable amount of comfort. To ensure these requirements I decided that the boat, whatever her dimensions, must be fully decked, and that she must be powerful enough to face and successfully battle with a whole gale of wind. Also, she must be capable of being handled by Billy and myself. Taking these requirements as a basis, I set to work upon my sketches. The relative dimensions of the boat would be governed to a considerable extent by her rig. A cutter-rigged craft is more powerful than any other, but it is open to the objection that the mainsail, the cutter's most important sail, is an awkward sail to handle in a sudden emergency, if the craft happens to be short-handed, as we should be. I believed, however, that this difficulty might be overcome by watchfulness and the taking of timely precautions. Therefore, after weighing the matter carefully, I decided in favor of the cutter rig. Bearing all the requirements in mind, I set to work, and ultimately evolved a design for a craft 30 feet long on the waterline by 10 feet beam, and 6 feet draught of water aft. To build a boat of these dimensions, with only Billy to help me, was a sufficiently ambitious project, but I had learned a good deal while building our existing boat, and, after all, I felt sure that if I should need more manpower, Bowata would willingly lend me some of his people. Also, realizing that henceforth Billy and I would be fully occupied in building the new boat, the thought occurred to me that it was high time to secure such domestic help as would enable us to give our whole time and thought to our work, without troubling about such matters as cooking, house-cleaning, and so on. Such help could only be obtained through Bowata. I therefore decided to seize an early opportunity to interview him upon the whole matter. Meanwhile, however, now that I had at last determined to attempt the building of a sea-going boat, I was all impatience to make a beginning, and as I, further, came to the conclusion that the beginning, so far as the framing of the keel, stem, and sternpost was concerned, must be made aboard the wreck, where all the materials were at hand, we lost no time in again removing ourselves, with all necessary goods and chattels, to what remained of the Yorkshire Lass. Here I made a start by laying out full size, in chalk, upon the afterdeck, an accurate outline of the keel, stem, and sternpost, which greatly facilitated my work. My chief difficulty, I discovered, was to find bolts at once of the required length and the necessary strength, since I could not possibly make them, and this difficulty absorbed so much time that we spent nearly a month on the wreck before the keel, stem, and sternpost were framed together in readiness to be set up on the beach at Eden, where I intended to do the remainder of the work. The framework was much too big and heavy to be conveyed to Eden otherwise than by towing, and as the whole trip was more or less a beat to windward, the transport of it cost us 2 days, our arrival home occurring so late in the afternoon that there was no time to attempt anything further that day. But on the day following I sailed over to Bowata's Island and explained to him my requirements, finding him more than eager to do anything and everything he could to oblige me. The domestic question was very easily arranged, Bowata suggesting that I should employ a man whom he could especially recommend, and who, with his 2 wives, would be able to do everything required in that particular direction, while as for labor for the building of the cutter, he assured me I might have as many men as I wished, for as long a time as I needed them. Nothing could be more satisfactory than this, the only point I felt doubtful about being the domestic part of the arrangement, but Billy settled this by undertaking to supervise the work until the man and his wives should be trained to efficiency, and the plan, when put into operation, worked excellently. The keel of the new boat being now ready, the next thing was to set it up, accurately plumb, longitudinally and transversely, upon the building blocks, and to do this I obtained the loan of 20 natives for a day, for the keel, with stem and sternpost attached, was much too heavy a mass of timber for Billy and me to manipulate without assistance, and with their help the work was most satisfactorily accomplished, they doing the manual work under Billy's guidance, while I supervised and directed the adjustments that were frequently necessary. I next set up 5 stout moulds, one at the midship section of the boat, with 2 aft and 2 forward of it, giving the exact shape of the boat at those points, and to the moulds I firmly attached several temporary whales and stringers, thus obtaining a kind of skeleton giving an accurate idea of the form of the finished boat. And when I had got thus far with my work and inspected the result from various viewpoints, I was as much amazed at my own audacity in attempting so ambitious an undertaking as I was gratified at the appearance which it presented, for I saw before me the outline of a very shapely, yacht-like little ship that, if I knew anything of such matters, promised to be fast, weatherly, and a very fine sea-boat, quite capable of taking care of herself when hove to, even in a heavy gale of wind. It was my intention to plank her upon the diagonal principle, using 3 thicknesses of comparatively thin plank, for I had no means by which to steam a single layer of planking of the necessary thickness, and so render it pliable enough to bend to the correct shape, while I believed that by using thin plank I could bend it to shape unsteamed. I am getting somewhat ahead of my yarn, however, for the progress outlined above represented nearly 3 months' hard work, an appreciable proportion of which had to be done a second time, owing to my inexperience. With the accession of our black helpers, our domestic arrangements flourished exceedingly, the only difficulty we experienced in connection with them occurring during the first fortnight or 3 weeks after their arrival, the trouble arising with Kit, who violently resented their intrusion and had to be kept strictly tied up until he had learned to understand that he must in no wise interfere with them. But even after reaching this stage the natives had to be exceedingly careful how they conducted themselves in his presence, for he never advanced farther than the merest toleration of them, while when any of the other blacks were on Eden, assisting me to build the cutter, it was absolutely necessary to keep the beast closely confined to the house until they had left. I very soon made the discovery that, had I been obliged to depend solely upon the efforts of Billy and myself, I should have been compelled to abandon the idea of building the cutter at a very early stage of the operations. It was not so much that we had found the work beyond our strength, although in that respect we were often glad enough to have a little additional help, but it was often necessary to have a plank or a railing, or some such matter, held firmly in position at half a dozen points or more at the same moment, while I fixed it, and it was on such occasions that I welcomed the assistance of the natives. And as such occasions occurred pretty frequently, it happened that I was kept au courant with everything of importance, and with a great deal that was exceedingly unimportant, that occurred on Cliff Island. Thus I came to know that, contrary to hope and expectation, the arming of the natives with bows and arrows, with the resulting destruction of the raiding apes, had been absolutely ineffective in checking the raids, which were now occurring more frequently and in greater force than ever. It appeared almost as though the brutes were possessed of sufficient intelligence to understand that something had happened rendering it no longer possible for attacks by small numbers to be successful, and that they were strengthening their attacking forces accordingly, with the evident determination to succeed ultimately at whatever cost. I was greatly vexed to hear this, for it was evident that the existence of such formidable beasts in the group consisted a growing menace to the human life in it, and I was wondering how this menace was to be fought, when Bowata and his people, without consulting me, made an attempt to solve the problem, which, for a short time at least, seemed to be crowned with success. It was the height of summer, and there had been a spell of some 6 weeks of very hot, dry weather, when, on a certain morning, as Billy and I, with some natives, were at work upon the cutter, the lad directed my attention to a thin cloud of light brownish-blue smoke rising in the air beyond Cliff Island. There was a gentle easterly breeze blowing at the time, sweeping the smoke away in the direction of West Island, and, as we watched, the cloud rapidly increased in density, its color darkened, and, somewhat to my astonishment, it seemed to spread in an easterly direction, or against the wind. It soon became clear that it was the forest on Apes Island that had caught fire, and it was equally evident that, thanks to the long dry spell, and to the fanning of the easterly breeze, the fire was spreading with great rapidity, for within 20 minutes of the appearance of the first light film of smoke we were able to see, over the eastern extremity of Cliff Island, the flames speeding up the hillside toward the conical summit of the island, preceded by so vast a volume of smoke that it completely veiled the hills of West Island from our sight. While Billy and I stood watching the rapid march of the flames, one of the natives, noticing our interest in the spectacle, approached and informed us that Bowata and one of his sons, determined to drive the apes off Apes Island, had that morning crossed Apes Channel in the punt which I had given them, with the avowed intention of setting the entire island on fire, beginning at its northern extremity, in order to drive the apes away from that part of the island from whence they were wont to start to swim the channel, and thence working round the shore to the eastern extremity of the island, hoping thus to drive the anthropoids in a westerly and southerly direction, right away from Cliff Island. As Apes Island was everywhere densely covered with forest and undergrowth, it was exceedingly probable that, unless something unforeseen occurred to extinguish the fire, every living thing upon it would be destroyed, except such creatures as might essay to swim the middle channel and take refuge upon West Island. But as the day progressed and the fire advanced, spreading ever more rapidly as great volumes of sparks were borne by the wind on ahead of the main body of flame, kindling subsidiary fires in advance, I began to doubt whether West Island would escape, remembering as I did that there was a stretch of the middle channel which was little more than half a mile wide, across which such a tremendous volume of sparks as now filled the air might easily be wafted. Toward evening my anticipation in this respect was verified, for upon ascending to the summit of our own peak on Eden, at the conclusion of our day's work, we saw that not only was the surface of Apes Island an unbroken expanse of black smoking ashes and charred tree stumps, but that the fire had leapt Middle Channel, and practically the whole eastern side of West Island was a mass of flame. The destruction of life would of course be enormous, but such glimpses as had thus far been afforded us of the animal life upon the group seemed to indicate that it was inimical to mankind, and if its destruction involved that of the apes, it was not to be greatly regretted. I waited 3 days to allow the ashes to cool, and then, taking Billy with me, sailed for the Middle Channel, running the boat ashore on Apes Island at a spot where a stream of fresh water discharged into the narrowest part of the channel. Here we landed, and started to walk eastward over and through ashes that were ankle-deep and in places still unpleasantly hot. I was quite prepared to find evidences that the destruction of animal life had been tremendous. But even so, I was amazed at the innumerable scorched and shriveled carcasses of creatures that had made their way to the water's edge and had there perished, probably suffocated by the smoke, because they had feared to take to the water. They lay thick upon the ground, huddled together, as far as the eye could reach to the right and left of the spot where we landed, and the odor of burnt flesh was almost overpowering, while flies and birds swarmed about them in legions. The remains were mostly so far consumed as to be impossible of identification, but here and there we came upon what, judging from the skull and teeth, had once been a creature of the cat tribe, probably a leopard, while the skeletons of snakes, some of them from their dimensions evidently pythons, were numerous. We also came upon several carcasses of what I thought might have been boars, but, if they were, the creatures must have been huge specimens of their kind. There were also a few calcined skeletons of animals that must have been as big as or bigger than a British dray horse, but of a very different build. They did not suggest any animal with which I was acquainted, and I was quite unable to put a name to them. We walked 2 miles or more inland before turning back, but nowhere did I see anything suggesting the destruction of so much as a solitary ape, at which I was nowise surprised, for I felt sure that the apes at least would be able to keep well ahead of the fire, and make good their escape to West Island. But West Island was, like Apes Island, a fire-blackened ruin as far as the eye could see, toward both the north and the south, and if the fire had swept clean across the island to its western shore, it would mean another holocaust, in which the apes also would be involved, for there was no retreat, no sanctuary beyond West Island. It was too late to push our investigations farther that day, but I resolved that on the morrow I would see what the western side of West Island looked like. Accordingly, 8 o'clock in the morning of the following day found Billy and me emerging from the northwest channel into the lagoon, and hauling round to the southward to skirt the western shore of West Island. We needed not to travel so far as this, however, to discover that at least part of West Island had escaped the ravages of fire, for upon our arrival off the southwestern extremity of Cliff Island, we saw that, owing to the greatly increased width of the Middle Channel at that point, the direction of the wind, and the peculiar configuration of the island itself, an area which I roughly estimated at about 100 square miles at its northern extremity, had been untouched by the flames, and this area of forest, although probably little more than a quarter of that of the whole island, would still afford cover for a good many animals, had they the sense, or the instinct, to escape to it. It was not until we had rounded the northern extremity of West Island, and had followed the west coast southward for a distance of about 11 miles, that we again came upon the ruin wrought by the flames, which, we found, had swept right across the island, leaving the area above referred to untouched, while to the southward as far as the eye could see, all was black ruin and desolation. At this point, too, signs of the devastation wrought upon the animal life of the island began to reveal themselves in the shape, first of isolated carcasses, and then of groups of the same, rapidly becoming more numerous and more crowded as the boat glided along southward within a stone's throw of the beach. As I was exceedingly anxious to discover whether or not the apes had escaped the destruction that had overtaken the other creatures inhabiting the two fire-stricken islands, we landed at various points along the beach, and made short investigating excursions inland, coming upon the remains of animals and reptiles of several different kinds. The variety indeed was astonishing, including, I regretted to see, 2 or 3 varieties of deer, and at length we found the half-consumed carcasses of 3 apes, close together, but we found no more that day. It was by this time drawing on toward sunset. Accordingly we made sail for the wreck of the brigantine, and took up our quarters aboard her for the night. Early on the following morning we resumed our inspection of West Island, starting at the point where we had left off on the previous evening, and on this day we came upon the remains of 2 more apes, several miles apart. But although those 5 carcasses of apes were all that we found, it was of course quite possible that there might have been many more, for our excursions inland were necessarily of very limited extent. To have made anything approaching a complete examination of the burnt area would have been the work of weeks, rather than of days, and I was indisposed to devote very much time to such an undertaking. Moreover, the effluvium arising from so many rapidly decomposing carcasses was, of itself, a sufficient deterrent. But slight and limited as was our examination, it sufficed to prove that the island must have literally swarmed with animal life, several species of which were, as in the case of those found on Apes Island, quite new to me; and late in the day, having extended our walk to the crest of a hill, we discovered that there was, a little south of the middle of the island, a triangular-shaped lake, about 6 miles long by about 5 miles broad at its western end, that had served to protect and preserve a clump of forest about 2 miles long, and the sounds that proceeded from it indicated that many animals had found sanctuary there. By the time that we had completed our survey it was too late to think of returning to Eden that day, so we again bore up for the wreck, spending the night aboard her and returning to our own island on the day following. On our way back I touched at Cliff Island and had a chat with Bowata, relating to him the result of our trip of inspection. I told him that we had seen very few dead apes, and hazarded the conjecture that the brutes, retreating before the flames on their own island, had swum the middle channel to West Island, on the northern and unburnt portion of which they might have established themselves. But when he suggested that this portion also of the island should be set on fire, to make assurance doubly sure, I very strongly demurred, pointing out that, even if my conjecture should be correct, the unburned forest would doubtless be swarming with animal life other than that of the apes, and that it would be a very great pity to destroy it all in order to effect the extermination of the apes, unless such a drastic measure should prove to be imperatively necessary. After the little break following upon the firing of Apes Island, I returned with enthusiasm to work upon the cutter, and, in the course of a month, used up all the available material which I had thus far accumulated, necessitating another visit to the wreck to obtain more. I collected as large a quantity as I believed I could conveniently handle, and, forming it into a raft, took it in tow for transport to Eden. The passage, that under ordinary conditions could easily be accomplished in a single day, occupied 5 days, and was, I think, the toughest job I had ever undertaken in my life, the raft being so deadly sluggish in movement that it was impossible to tow it to windward, and I finally found myself compelled to kedge it more than half the way. But I was glad when I had, at length, brought it safely into the cove and anchored it there, for I now had enough material to carry on with for at least 4 months. I estimated that another raft of equal size would suffice to complete the cutter, and, notwithstanding the difficulties that I had just encountered, I felt strongly inclined to return forthwith to the wreck and procure a sufficiency for all future needs. But I was very tired after my labors, and I finally persuaded myself to postpone the task for a while, to my subsequent intense regret. The anniversary of the wreck of the Yorkshire Lass arrived and passed. We had been a whole year on the group, and, so far as we knew, not a solitary sail of any description had come within sight of the islands during the whole of those 12 months. It was an astounding, incomprehensible fact. I had never really anticipated such a possibility. With the passage of each day, each week, each month, I had said to myself, with gradually waning assurance certainly, "It cannot be long now before a craft of some sort comes along to take us off." Until the moment when it suddenly dawned upon me that if we were ever to escape, it must be through our own efforts, my own especially. This conviction now came upon me with overwhelming force. My hopes of deliverance by means of some extraneous agency suddenly sank to zero, and I began to work with such febrile energy that it presently drew from Billy a steadily growing flood of remonstrance. I had by this time expended so much of my material that I was in the very act of preparing for another visit to the wreck to obtain more, when poor Billy fell sick of some sort of a fever. Within 3 hours of his seizure he became delirious, and was so extremely violent that, he being by this time a strong sturdy boy, I was obliged to at once drop everything else to look after him and see that he did not injure himself during the more severe paroxysms. Of course I had long ago taken the precaution to secure possession of the ship's medicine chest, with its accompanying book of instructions, but the latter afforded me little help, for I could find in it no case the symptoms of which quite corresponded with those of my patient, and I was therefore compelled to rely very much upon my own judgment, and upon the instructions for the treatment of fevers in general. A liberal administration of quinine seemed to constitute the most hopeful form of treatment, and luckily we possessed an ample supply of the drug. I accordingly dosed Billy with it for close upon 60 hours, when the delirium ceased and the poor boy sank into a semi-stupor of exhaustion, which enabled one of the native women to relieve me by watching at the patient's bedside. I had by this time been without sleep for 2 nights and more than 3 days, and I was therefore glad enough to be free to retire to my own room to rest for an hour or two. Arrived there, I removed my boots and then, without troubling to remove further clothing, flung myself upon my bed and instantly sank into complete oblivion. End of chapter 12. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois.
Chapter 13 of The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melissa Jean. The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn by Harry Collingwood. Chapter 13. We Exterminate the Apes. I was aroused to consciousness by the flash of dazzling light upon my closed eyelids, accompanied by the crash of a terrific clap of thunder. Opening my eyes, I discovered that the room was in opaque darkness, showing that I must have been allowed to sleep at least 8 hours. But even as I swung my feet to the floor and started to grope for my boots, while the reverberations of the thunderclap still rumbled and echoed in the distance, there came another blinding flash of lightning, instantly followed by a deafening crash of thunder. And, getting my bearings by the illumination of the lighting, I started to my feet, and forgetting my boots, rushed to Billy's bedside, apprehensive of what might be the effect of the storm upon him. I found the patient not only awake, but also in his right mind. "Well, Billy, my boy, how are you by this time?" I demanded. I believe I'm better, thank you, Mr. Blackburn," replied the boy. but I feel very weak, and, oh goodness, isn't it hot? It was. I had just found time to become aware of the excessive heat and closeness of the atmosphere. The perspiration was simply streaming from every pore of my body, and I felt suffocating for want of sufficient air. All the doors and windows of the bungalow were wide open, but the atmosphere was absolutely stagnant, the naked flame of a newly ignited lamp burning without the faintest flicker. One of our native domestics was now busying herself arranging the table in what we called the dining room, and in laying out the materials for a supper for me, for it now appeared that I had slept for nearly 14 hours on end, and the good woman insisted that I must have a meal at once. While these preparations were in progress, I went out and stood under the veranda to take a look at the weather. The thunderclap that had broken in upon my slumbers proved to be the prelude to a terrific electrical disturbance, which was now in full action. The center of the disturbance appeared to be almost immediately overhead, for flash after flash of lightning was striking all around the house, while the detonations of the thunder were continuous and so violent that I felt the floor literally tremble beneath my feet. But the lightning was not confined to discharges from the cloud overhead. It was darting earthward all around us, and practically at all distances from zenith to horizon, and so frequent were the discharges that the illumination from them was continuous, revealing a vault packed with enormous masses of heavy, black, writhing cloud. I stood for perhaps 5 minutes, fascinated by the spectacle of the vivid lightning play, and then, just as the native woman came out to announce that my supper was ready, down came the rain in a perfect deluge. And in a moment the eaves of the house, the foliage of the trees, and the earth itself poured with soft, warm water. It was too good an opportunity to be wasted, so I hurried to my own room, threw off my clothes, seized a morsel of soap, and dashing out to the midst of the downpour, treated myself to a most delightful and refreshing bath, as a preliminary to supper. The rain continued for about half an hour, and then it ceased with that abruptness which seems so characteristic of the tropics. But it had scarcely come to an end when there arose a loud rustling of leaves among the trees in the garden, and round about the house a blast of hot wind poured in through the open doors and windows, violently slamming the former, and causing the latter to rattle furiously. I had barely time to rush and close them all when a terrific squall came roaring down upon the bungalow. This squall was only the precursor of several that followed each other at rapidly decreasing intervals, until those intervals became so brief as to be no longer distinguishable, and the wind settled into a roaring gale from the westward that blew all night and did not break until close upon noon the next day. As luck would have it, I had chosen the eastern slope of the peak as the site upon which to erect the bungalow. Consequently, the structure was, to a very great extent, sheltered from the gale by the hill behind it. But even so, the building quivered and shook under the stroke of the blasts, and my heart sank as I thought of the wreck, for I felt that she had not one chance in 1,000 of weathering it out. She was on what was now the windward reef, as it had been when she struck upon it. The surf would pile up on the reef again, raising the level of the water by perhaps 3 or 4 feet, and in that case the poor old Yorkshire lass would be washed off to the coral into the lagoon, and would there sink, and with her would go all the material that I needed for the completion of the cutter. Then there was the cutter herself, or at least as much of her as had thus far been put together. How would she stand the buffeting to which she was being subjected? I was hopeful, for she was at this time merely a skeleton, and a very imperfect skeleton at that. Consequently, there would not be much for the wind to take hold of. Yet I was anxious too, for I feared lest the heavy rain might have displaced some of the keel blocks, and so let the craft down, and perhaps strained her out of shape. So anxious, indeed, was I that I would have gone down to the cove at once, despite the fury of the wind. But the night was so pitch dark that I could have seen nothing, nor single-handed could have done anything, whatever might have happened. So I was perforce obliged to defer my visit until daylight. But when daylight came, I fought my way down to the cove against the gale that was still blowing, and there found, to my inexpressible relief, that nothing had happened but what could be put right in an hour or two. I was naturally most anxious to ascertain what, if anything, had happened to the wreck, but it was not until nearly a week after the gale that Billy had progressed so far toward recovery that I was able to leave him entirely in the care of the natives. When, however, that moment arrived, I took immediate advantage of it, starting for the scene of the wreck immediately after an early breakfast, and enjoining Billy not to be anxious should I be detained until the next day. With a fair wind all the way, the boat made short miles of the trip, and I reached the scene of the wreck fairly early in the afternoon. But at least an hour before my arrival, my worst fears were realized, for where the wreck had once been, there was now no sign of her. But I knew pretty well where to look for her. and coasting along the inner edge of the reef, I ultimately came upon her within a few fathoms of the reef, sunk in 6 fathoms of water, and of course irrevocably lost to us. I thought, however, that possibly some useful wreckage might be floating about the lagoon. I therefore worked the boat over to West Island Beach, near to which I did indeed find a few planks and some small odds and ends that had broken adrift or floated off when the wreck went down, and these I formed into a small raft, which I towed round to Eden on the following day. But when I looked from the skeleton of the cutter to the small quantity of material available for her completion, my heart sank within me, and I felt utterly discouraged, for what I had was ridiculously inadequate. It was not enough even to complete the shell of the craft, and where on earth was I to get more? There were, of course, thousands of trees on the group, and I had an axe with which to fell them, but when they were felled, how was I to convert them into plank and scantling? It was a problem which I puzzled over during the whole day succeeding my return to Eden, seeking in vain for a solution, until at last it seemed that we were really doomed to remain where we were until taken off by a ship, even though we should grow old while awaiting her arrival. Such a conclusion would doubtless have been terribly discouraging to many people, but after the first shock, its effect upon me was, on the contrary, so provocative that I resumed work upon the cutter with more resolution than ever, if that were possible, until some 6 weeks later I had used up all my available material, and my work was perforce brought to a standstill. But when this happened I had made such progress that the cutter was planked up to the gunwale with the first thickness of planking, and so thoroughly satisfied was I with my work that I was determined nothing should prevent its completion, even though, to provide the necessary material, I should be compelled to pull down the bungalow and break up our sailing boat. Such forcible measures as those, however, demanded the most careful consideration before adoption. Meanwhile, the rank luxuriance of tropical plant growth had already changed the fire-blackened areas of Apes and West Islands to varying tints of delicate green, the several varieties of new vegetation seeming to find congenial conditions in the thick coat of ashes resulting from the fire. But I learned from Bowata, whose people had been maintaining a close watch upon both islands, that thus far no signs of animal life had been detected upon either of them, although the chief agreed with me that whatever might be the case with Apes Island, West Island, or at least the unburnt part of it, must be simply swarming with living creatures. And the conviction that this was so was causing him and his people so much uneasiness that a permanent watch had been established at the western end of Cliff Island, and the natives resident there, to the number of 40, had all been armed with bows and arrows, that they might be prepared to repel possible incursions of apes from that part of West Island, the channel at that point being but little wider than that which the apes were wont to swim when crossing from their own island. The liability to incursions by the apes seemed to be the only source of anxiety on the part of Bowata and his people. In all other respects they appeared to be perfectly happy, for their wants were few, and so fertile was the soil of their own island that it amply supplied all those wants, with very little exertion on the part of the easy-going inhabitants. The trouble was that the products of their industry unfortunately appealed so strongly to the appetite of the anthropods that, to gratify it, the brutes were willing to swim a channel a mile wide. And the trouble was serious enough in all conscience, for as I gradually learned, in the course of frequent conversations with the chief, the apes not only destroyed far more than they ate, but until my introduction of the bow and arrow as weapon, they were only driven off with the utmost difficulty, and frequently with serious loss of life on the part of the savages. It was indeed to put an effectual end to those frequent raids upon their property that the natives, in desperation, had finally resorted to the drastic measure of setting fire to the island that harboured the monsters. The longer I meditated upon the problem of how to meet the shortage of material for the completion of the cutter, the more reluctant did I become to resort to so extreme a measure as the breaking up of the sailing boat, still more to the bungalow, to supply the deficiency. In my perplexity, I visited East Island, and here a possible way out of the difficulty was suggested to me by the discovery, as I then for the first time particularly noticed, that certain of the trees flourishing on that island appeared to be, if not actually cedars, at least a species very nearly akin thereto. And if upon closer investigation this should prove to be the case, here was a supply of timber admirably suited to my requirements, and ample beyond my utmost needs. It was a matter worthy of my most particular attention, and accordingly I selected a group of the supposed cedars, and forthwith proceeded to operate upon them. They were 3 in number, of just about the right size for my requirements, and they were within a quarter mile of the cove. I began my investigation by hacking off a good stout branch, stripping off its bark, and testing its working qualities. I found that the wood gave off the characteristic odor of cedar, that it was close-grained, that it was easily workable, and that it was, in short, everything I could possibly desire. I therefore started work in earnest by felling the tree that I had already attacked and trimming off its branches. This brought my day's work to a close, and I returned to Eden with a mind relieved of a heavy load of anxiety, for there was now no longer any need to contemplate the breaking up of either the boat or the bungalow. True, I had found the wood I required, but what I needed was thin planks, not heavy bulks of timber such as one might be able to hew out of a tree trunk with an axe. And how was I to obtain those planks? I considered the matter, and suddenly remembered that cedar splits easily. I therefore determined to ascertain by actual experiment whether it would be possible to procure the planks I required by splitting the felled trunk. The experiment was on the whole successful, for although I wasted more timber than I anticipated, I nevertheless succeeded in securing several very fine planks that, when operated upon with the plane, could be reduced to the exact thickness required. Thus encouraged, I made an estimate of the quantity of planking required to complete the hull of the cutter, and then proceeded to fell as many trees as were needed to furnish that quantity. It was while I was thus engaged that I one day received an urgent visit from Bowata and his son, who came in great distress to inform me that the watchers posted on the western extremity of Cliff Island to guard against a surprise attack on the part of the apes, believed to have retreated to West Island, had that morning reported that the anthropoids were recrossing the middle channel to Apes Island, and that from observation of the creatures' movements it was strongly suspected that they meditated an attack in force upon Cliff Island and its inhabitants. Bowata concluded his communication with an entreaty that I would lend my aid to repel the threatened attack. I at once acceded to this request, and with the two natives aboard the sailing boat and their punt in tow, proceeded to Eden, where I collected all the arms and ammunition we possessed, and taking Billy with me, made sail for Cliff Island. As we approached the northern extremity of Apes Island, from which point the brutes usually started on their swim across the channel to Cliff Island, my telescope revealed numerous apes clustered together upon the beach, while many others could be seen wending their way toward the same spot. But I could see none in the water, so concluded that the threatened raid had not yet started. I inquired of Bowata how many of his people were now armed with bows and arrows, and was gratified to learn that every male above the age of 15 had so been armed. This meant that there were more than 100 archers to defend the island, learning which I came to the conclusion that the best form of defense was attack, and made my plans accordingly. Landing Bowata and his son to conduct the defense of their island, I took aboard the boat 7 natives, who the chief assured me were among his most expert bowmen, and headed across the channel toward Apes Island, my plan being to cruise to and fro opposite the spot where the apes were mustering, and to pick off as many of the brutes as possible while passing. At this point the channel was only about a mile wide. 10 minutes, therefore, sufficed us to accomplish the passage, and to round to at a distance of 20 yards from the beach, where some 50 or 60 of the gigantic brutes were now assembled, most of them squatting upon their haunches, as though awaiting a signal of some sort, while others were joining them at the rate of 2 or 3 per minute. As the boat approached, the monsters eyed her malignantly, while several rose to their feet as though preparing to repel an attack. This suited our purpose well, and as the boat, under Billy's skilful handling, rounded to into the wind with her sails a-shiver, glided slowly past the spot where the apes were congregated, we each deliberately selected our target, and drawing our bows to the full length of our arrows, let fly with deadly effect. Every arrow went home, many of them finding the heart, and with screams of mingled pain and rage 8 of the apes crashed to the ground, a few of them writhing convulsively in their death agony, but most of them dead. There was time for a second discharge before the boat drifted too far away, and 3 more of the brutes went down, while 5 of their comrades, screaming and bellowing with pain and rage, wrenched the arrows from their wounds, some of them in their blind fury turning upon and savagely attacking their fellows. The maneuver was so successful that it was repeated with equally satisfactory results. Thus far the unwounded apes appeared to take little or no notice of the havoc we were working among them, and I feel certain that none of them connected that havoc with the appearance of the boat upon the scene. But when the maneuver was repeated a 3rd time, and still more of their number fell dead or wounded, it seemed at last to dawn upon their imperfect intelligence that the strange object with its white sails, which glided to and fro upon the water opposite them, must somehow be associated with the casualties occurring among their companions, and with yells of concentrated fury and eyes ablaze with deadly malice, about a dozen of them shambled down the beach into the water, and striking out, started to swim in the pursuit of the boat. Nothing could have suited us better than this senseless act of the great anthropoids, for although they swam fast, the boat could easily outdistance them in the breeze then blowing, and I signed to Billy to edge away toward a wider part of the channel, so that, when they should discover how impossible it was to overtake the boat, they might have the farther to swim, should any of them escape us and attempt to make their way across to Cliff Island. But the precaution was unnecessary, for when they were in the water and swimming, we could do so as we would with them, and within a few minutes every ape that had started in pursuit of the boat was slain. By this time, however, others had also taken to the water, there being now at least 30 of them swimming, some in pursuit of the boat, while others headed directly across the channel towards Cliff Island. This necessitated an alteration of our plans, yet we still contrived to keep the boat between the apes and the island, crossing and recrossing in front of the brutes at a distance of 5 to 10 yards, so that it was impossible for us to miss them. Thus the slaughter went on until my very soul revolted at such terrible destruction, for the brutes continued to come on by dozens and scores until there seemed to be no end of them. Most creatures would have had intelligence enough to recognize that their persistence meant death to them, and would have turned back, either discouraged or terrified, but the apes seemed to be incapable of either emotion, and pressed resolutely on, so that their destruction became imperative if the natives of Cliff Island were not to be abandoned to their tender mercies. But that sort of thing could not go on forever. The number of the brutes gradually decreased, and at the end of about 3 hours the last ape in sight succumbed to our attack, and it then appeared probable that we had exterminated the entire tribe of the dangerous and formidable creatures. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melissa Jean. The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn by Harry Collingwood. Chapter 14. Attacked by Chinese Pirates. The destruction of the apes accomplished, I returned with avidity to the task of felling cedar trees on the East Island and splitting the trunks into planks for the completion of the cutter, for I had by this time entirely abandoned the hope of rescue by a passing ship. It was about 3 weeks later that, emerging on a certain morning from my bedroom and stepping out to the veranda to scan the offing, according to custom, before beginning the regular routine of the day, my gaze was instantly arrested by an object poised on the very verge of the horizon, some 12 miles distant. Showing up almost black against the vivid hues of the early morning eastern sky, it was yet too small to be capable of identification by the unassisted eye. I therefore darted back into the house, and procuring the telescope, brought it to bear upon the stranger, and as I focused the image of that distant object in the lenses of my instruments, I experienced a moment of most bitter disappointment. For when my gaze fell first upon that tiny speck, the thought instantly leapt to my mind that at long last the moment of our deliverance had arrived, whereas a moment or two later my telescope revealed to me the disconcerting fact that the craft in sight, and heading straight for the group, was a Chinese junk. It may be that certain of my readers will wonder why the approach of a Chinese junk to the group should cause me such acute disappointment, and they may perhaps ask the question, is not a Chinese junk as capable as any other vessel of rescuing shipwrecked people and conveying them back to civilization? To this question I would reply, yes, undoubtedly, under certain circumstances. But let me explain the proviso implied in that reply. Had the boy Billy and I only been concerned, I would have trusted ourselves aboard the junk. But there was the treasure to be considered. I was not altogether ignorant concerning the character and reputation of Chinese sailors. There may be, and probably are, Chinamen who are as honorable, upright, and honest as the average Englishman. But my experience, such as it has been, is that they are not to be found aboard a junk. The Chinese seaman is, as a rule, drawn from the lowest stratum of his people, and among such men the moral sense, if not absolutely lacking, is very nearly so. They are barbarian, and all their instincts are primitive. Honor and honesty are words that have no meaning for them. They are, before all things else, intensely acquisitive, and if they want a thing, they will take it if they can, and woe betide the owner if he resists them. In a word, the Chinese seaman is by instinct a pirate, and a cruel, bloodthirsty one at that. Hence my feeling of disappointment at the sight of that junk, for how could I hope that our treasure would remain involatile if placed in the power of such men as I have endeavoured to describe? They would cut our throats without scruple in order to possess themselves the contents of our chests, the very appearance of which was irresistibly suggestive of treasure. It took me not a moment to determine that, rather than expose ourselves to such possible risks, we would have nothing whatever to do with the junk if we could avoid it. But could we? The junk was heading straight for the group, running before a light easterly breeze which would probably give her a speed of about 3 knots, and in the course of the next 3 hours she would be close enough to enable her crew to see the bungalow, the existence of which it was impossible to conceal, built as it was high up on the hillside with a passage through the reef immediately opposite it. Was it at all reasonable to suppose that any craft would sail past the group without calling to investigate? There was of course the possibility that the junk in sight might be perfectly harmless, and that if she entered the lagoon it would be merely to satisfy curiosity, and perhaps to obtain a little fruit or to replenish her stock of fresh water. And, if so, well and good. But if not, if her crew happened to be composed of such ruffians as I have endeavoured to picture, what then? Could I hope that they would be satisfied merely to come up to the bungalow, ask a few questions in Picton English, and depart, leaving us unscathed? To suppose any such thing would be, to say the least of it, foolishness. The probability was that they would attack us, sack the place, carrying away everything that took their fancy, including the treasure chests, murder me and Billy, and burn down the house out of sheer love of destruction. These reflections, which have taken me so long to record, flashed through my mind upon the instant following my recognition of the character of the stranger, and realization of the danger that possibly threatened us naturally led to the question, how is that danger to be averted? Could Billy and I alone hope to put up a successful defence against an attack by perhaps 30 or 40 determined men? For let Chinamen be what they may in other respects, they are not easily daunted by a sense of personal danger, especially if animated by the hope of plunder. Then in a moment there came to me the memory of Bowata and the natives of Cliff Island. They had been most profuse in their expressions of gratitude for the help which we had afforded them from time to time, and had repeatedly declared their eagerness to find an opportunity to give practical demonstration of that gratitude. Here was their opportunity, and all that was needed was to make them aware of it. I took another long look at the junk, and came to the conclusion that she would not reach the lagoon in much less than 4 hours, which would allow me time to make a single trip in the boat to Cliff Island, get into touch with Bowata, secure his assistance, and return to Eden with my dusky reinforcements. I decided to do so, and without waiting for breakfast, at once started for the cove, and the boat. The wind being fair, I made a quick run across to Cliff Island, and a swift-footed native boy soon brought Bowata down to the landing place where we usually met. Explaining the circumstances to him, I found him, as I had quite anticipated, more than ready to render me every possible assistance, and departing to muster his men, he returned in a very short time with 19 of his most reliable fighters. The boat's utmost capacity was 20, in addition to myself, and the chief naturally elected to accompany and head his party. Those men, Bowata assured me, were the pick of the entire tribe, and I quite believed him, for although small and slight compared with the average Englishman, they were lithe, wiry, active, and resolute-looking men, with an eager gleam in their eyes which seemed to suggest that the prospect of a fight was the reverse of distasteful to them. They were each armed with a bow, a quiver full of arrows, and a most formidable-looking war-club, the head of which was thickly studded with bone spikes, and which promised to be terribly effective at close quarters. The latter being quite a recent addition to their armoury, invented by Bowata's son, whose imagination had at last been stimulated by the persistent attacks of the apes. The return passage to Eden, half of which was a dead beat to windward, with the boat loaded to her utmost capacity, occupied so long a time that I was in a perfect fever of anxiety lest the junk should arrive before us. But upon rounding the south-east point of Cliff Island, I was somewhat relieved to see that she had, so far, not entered the lagoon, nor did I see any sign of her during the remainder of the passage, for low down in the water as we were, the spray of the surf breaking upon the reef effectually veiled from our view everything outside. There was still no sign of the junk, when at length the boat entered the little cove that was our usual landing place, and grounded on the beach. 10 minutes later we surmounted the crest of the ridge, on the far side of which stood the bungalow, and I once more got a view of the open sea outside, over the curtain of everlasting spray that had obstructed my view from the boat. The junk was visible clearly enough, hove to at a distance of about a mile to windward of the reef. I hurried to the house for the telescope, that I might obtain a nearer view of what was happening aboard her. Seizing the telescope, I proceeded to the veranda, from which I brought the instrument to bear upon the craft. I now saw that she had lowered a boat that, manned by a crew of 5, was heading for the opening in the reef immediately opposite our land. This boat I watched, keeping the telescope bearing upon her, as she alternately topped and disappeared behind the long ridges of swells, until at length she passed through the opening and entered the lagoon. Once through the reef, she headed straight for Eden, and it looked as though the men in her contemplated landing on the beach at the foot of the slope upon which the bungalow was built. Whereupon I thought it well to hoist the brigantine's ensign upon the flagstaff I had set up in front of the bungalow, as a hint to the intruders that the island was British territory, and that its inhabitants expected that territory to be respected. The boat, approaching cautiously, at length reached a point about a quarter of a mile from the beach, when the crew lay upon their oars, while the man in the stern sheets rose to his feet and proceeded to subject Eden, and as much of the rest of the group as was visible from his point of view, to a prolonged scrutiny, after which, at a sign from him, the oars again dipped in the water, and turning the boat recrossed the lagoon and made her way back to the junk. There was now a pause in the proceedings, during which I conjectured that the man who had been in charge of the boat was making his report to his skipper. The pause, however, was not of long duration, for as I continued to watch, signs of a sudden stir aboard the junk became perceptible, and a few minutes later I saw that her crew were lowering 2 more boats, much larger than the first, and that a considerable number of men, who, so far as it was possible to see at a distance, were all armed, were swarming down the junk side into them. This seemed to indicate that my worst suspicions regarding the character of the vessel were only too well founded, and that a pretty stiff fight was in prospect for us. If this should be so, it was time to see about making my dispositions for the conflict. I accordingly re-entered the house, and, girding on my cutlass, thrust a brace of fully loaded revolvers into my belt, seized my own pet rifle, and filling my jacket pockets with cartridges, sallied forth, and joined Bowata and his party, led them down to the beach. This particular strip of beach, it should be explained, was quite unlike the other beaches of the group. The latter, composed of white coral sand, were continuous, smooth, unencumbered, averaged from 30 feet wide in some cases to as much as 100 feet wide in others, and usually sloped steeply enough to enable our boat, with good way on her, to run herself high enough on them to permit us to land dry-footed. On the other hand, the beach toward which we were now heading was a strip of coral sand not much more than a quarter of a mile long, perfectly smooth, but sloping so very gently that I much doubted whether the boats I had seen preparing to leave the junk could approach within 50 yards of the shore without grounding. But the circumstance most greatly in our favour was that this comparatively short length of beach, while inviting enough in appearance as a landing place, was backed on its shore side with an outcrop of black rocks that offered splendid cover for a defending force while leaving attackers from the sea completely exposed. These peculiarities of the shore rendered it morally certain that the beach itself would be the actual battle-ground in the coming conflict, and it was with the view to its decision there that I made my final arrangements, and posted Bowata and his men. Having done this to my satisfaction, I took my rifle and advanced to the beach, where I seated myself upon a detached fragment of rock and patiently awaited the developments. These proved to be somewhat slow in arriving, and the period of waiting was rendered all the more tedious from the fact that, low down on the beach as I now was, the continuous veil of spray flying over the reef effectually hid everything that might be happening to seaward. But at length, after waiting for fully an hour for something to happen, one of the Chinese boats appeared in the gap in the reef, closely followed by a second and a third. The 2 leading boats were largish craft, pulling 8 oars each, and they appeared to be carrying some 14 or 16 men each, while the third was the much smaller craft that had already once entered the lagoon, the crew of which seemed now to be augmented by 3 or 4 extra men. Once clear of the passage, they formed in line abreast, the smaller boat between the 2 big ones, while one man, doubtless the leader of the expedition, stood in the stern sheets, directing the movements of his little flotilla from time to time by a wave of his hand. The distance across the lagoon at this point, from the reef to the beach of Eden, was about a mile. The boats were therefore not long in traversing the distance, but I did not intend to allow our unwelcome visitors to land without a protest of some sort, and at the same time giving them something in the nature of a warning. I therefore waited until the boats had arrived within about 200 yards of the beach, when, rising to my feet, I discharged my rifle, aiming to send the shot a few yards above the head of the leader, who was still standing in the stern sheets of the smaller boat. As though my rifle shot had been a signal, the oarsmen of all three of the boats instantly ceased rowing, and a tremendous jabbering arose among them, which the leader silenced by raising his hand, at the same time shouting what I took to be a sharp command. The oarsmen dipped their starboard oars, sweeping the three boats broadside onto the beach. And the next moment, for I was saluted by a shower of bullets and slugs from some 20 jingles. For an instant the air all about me seemed to be full of lead, but I was untouched, and knowing that it would take them a minute or two to reload, I wheeled about, and crossing some half a dozen yards of open ground, took cover behind a convenient rock. As I did so, the boats again wheeled into line abreast, and with their crews excitedly jabbering and shouting to one another, dashed toward the beach at full speed, the leader drawing a most formidable-looking sword, and waving it above his head, with shouts of encouragement to his men. But as I had foreseen, the boats advanced, but with a few lengths farther, when the two bigger ones stopped dead, having grounded, and several of their occupants, unprepared for the sudden stoppage, toppled over backwards, creating great confusion among their comrades. At this moment I whistled shrilly, whereupon Bowata and his merry men arose from behind their ambush among the rocks, and taking deliberate aim, poured into the boat a flight of arrows, every one of which must have told, so short was the range, and so great was the confusion that ensued among the Chinese. Meanwhile the smaller boat, being of lighter draught, continued to come stem on for the beach. I was covering her, with my rifle nicely resting in a notch on the rock in front of me, and as she came fair end on, I pressed the trigger, and the two foremost oarsmen collapsed on their oars, both of them evidently shot by the one bullet. This naturally added to the confusion, but the leader, who appeared to exercise great influence over his men, soon restored order, and shouting a command to his followers, caused those in the grounded boats to leap overboard, where, with the water nearly up to their waists, they paused for a moment to discharge a second volley from their jingles. Then, tossing their cumbersome firearms back into the boat, they uttered a yell, drew their swords, and came charging helter-skelter through the water toward the beach. This was the opportunity for Bowata and his party, who, with arrows ready fitted to their bowstrings, again rose from behind their covering rocks, and let fly at the enemy. Some of the arrows missed their mark, but about 3/4 of them were effective, one man, I observed, receiving no less than 3 shafts in his body, and 5 of the enemy fell, while others came staggering forward with arrows sunk deep in various parts of their anatomy. The leader of the band, however, remained unhurt, and he continued by shouts to urge his men forward to the attack. It was evident that his followers derived great encouragement from his words and actions, and that to put him hors de combat would practically be to win the battle. Therefore, leaving my now empty rifle leaning against the rock behind which I had been crouching, I drew my cutlass and advanced to meet the fellow, determined to personally tackle him, and put him out of action without loss of time. He was a sufficiently formidable antagonist, it must be admitted, 2 inches taller than myself, broad in proportion, with an enormously massive chest and shoulders, and great muscles that stood out like cables under the skin of his bare arms. His features were typically Tartar, and his small eyes blazed with ferocity, as, waving his sword above his head, he advanced with a shout of defiance to meet me. Meanwhile, Bowata and his followers poured in still another flight of arrows, and then, flinging down their bows, they gripped their formidable war-clubs, and uttering weird yells, charged across the sand, and fell upon the Chinamen as they emerged from the water. I quite anticipated that the fight between the leader and myself would be a long and exceedingly tough one, but to my amazement it was begun and finished in a breath. The man came charging upon me with an uplifted sword, his evident intention being to make a cut at my head that should finish me out of hand. And indeed he very nearly accomplished his purpose, for as I raised my cutlass to guard my head, his blade descended upon it with terrific force, and shore my weapon clean in two. And if I had not at the same moment stepped nimbly aside, I would have assuredly been cloven to the eyes. As it was, the descending weapon missed me by a hair-breadth, shearing a large hole in the sleeve of my shirt, but not touching the skin. Scarcely realizing what was about, but acting upon instinct, or the impulse of the movement, I suppose, before my antagonist could again raise his weapon, I violently thrust my severed blade into his face, and as he staggered back with the force of the blow, I whipped out my revolver and shot him through the head. That ended the fight, for as the man fell dead at my feet, a shout of mingled horror and consternation arose from those Chinese who happened to witness the incident, and who thereupon incontinently turned and fled to their boats, an example immediately followed by their comrades, hotly pursued by blacks, who piled their war-clubs with terrible effect. It was a disastrous adventure for the Chinamen, For only the total number engaged, which I am estimated to be between 30 and 40, only 11 escaped, for I counted them. On the other hand, the casualties on our side were remarkably small, numbering only 7 wounded, the wounds consisting entirely of sword cuts, none of which was serious. Of those 7, Bowata happened to be one, his wound consisting of a sword thrust through the upper part of the left arm. I therefore took him and his 6 companions of misfortune up to the house to dress their wounds, leaving the remainder of the party on the beach to collect the weapons and their spent arrows, and to clear up generally. My surgical duties occupied about an hour and a half, and when all my patients had been attended to, I sent them with Billy down to the cove to be ferried across in the sailing boat to Cliff Island, where no doubt their own people would look after them. Then, remembering that there were wounded Chinamen among those abandoned on the beach, I started down to see what could be done for them. For although a party of wounded and no doubt treacherous and vindictive Chinks would be a most embarrassing charge to have on my hands, common humanity demanded that they should not be left to perish miserably where they had fallen. Before, however, I had covered half the distance between the bungalow and the beach, I met the remaining blacks marching triumphantly up the hill, singing a song of victory, and carrying not only their own recovered weapons, but also several swords that they had taken from the fallen enemy. They also brought the rifle that I had left on the beach, and the sword, scabbard, and belt of the Chinese leader, which they solemnly handed over to me as the victor. Seeing that they had evidently been busy among the fallen, I asked whether there were many wounded among the latter, to which the man whom I was questioning replied, "No, they were all dead," pointing significantly to his blood-smeared war-club by way of explanation. Well, it may perhaps seem inhuman to say it, but I was not altogether sorry. The men were undoubtedly pirates, if not by profession, pirates at least when opportunity seemed to be favourable. They had attacked me deliberately, and without provocation, and, but for the help of the blacks, Billy and I would unquestionably have been wiped out. 10 or a dozen of such men wounded would have been a terribly embarrassing charge for me to have assumed, but it would have been still more embarrassing to have them about the place when they were again hale and strong. No, taking everything into consideration, I was not altogether sorry that they had been put beyond the possibility of perpetrating further mischief. Meanwhile, what had become of the junk? I had looked for her just before leaving the bungalow on my way back to the beach, and I had sighted her some 6 miles off, in the southeastern quarter, heading to the southward, close hauled, by which I judged that no further trouble need be looked for from her. But there were the dead on the beach to be disposed of without loss of time. How could this disposal be best effected? I considered the matter, and presently hit upon a plan. The Chinese, in their precipitate fight, had abandoned 2 of their boats, namely the small one and one of the bigger ones. Those 2 would be sufficient to contain the whole of the dead, and, having now decided upon my mode of procedure, I led my little band of black warriors back to the beach, and with their assistance transferred the dead Chinamen to the 2 abandoned boats. We had barely completed this gruesome task when Billy returned with the sailing boat, whereupon I boarded her, sailed her round to the cove to the east beach, took the Chinese boats in tow, and anchored them for the night under the lee of the northern extremity of Eden. The next day I again took the boats in tow, and with a party of 8 natives to help me, towed them to the beach of North Island, where we buried the dead Chinamen. The smaller of the 2 boats I then presented to Bowata, in recognition of the assistance he had rendered me in repelling the attack by the Chinese, while the bigger one I kept for the sake of her materials, which would be valuable to me in the completion of the cutter. It was while clearing up and putting matters generally straight after the Chinamen's unwelcome visit that the sword of the leader again came under my notice, and impelled by curiosity, I drew the weapon from its sheath, and subjected it to a somewhat critical examination. For if that should prove satisfactory, I intended to make use of it in future, in place of the cutlass, the blade of which it had shorn through with such perfect ease. I found it to be somewhat heavier than the cutlass, the blade being considerably thicker than that of the other weapon, though not quite so wide. It was, however, perfectly balanced, and I was able to wield it with the utmost ease, while it was literally as keen-edged as a razor. And so exquisite was its temper that there was no sign of a notch or indentation of any description on its edge along its entire length, from point to hilt. I returned it to its sheath with much satisfaction, feeling that I had effected a most profitable exchange. End of Chapter 14.
Chapter 15 of The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn by Harry Collingwood. Chapter 15, A Surprising Reappearance. It was about 3 weeks later that, as Billy and I foregathered in the living room of the bungalow, early on a certain morning, discussing our biscuit and early cup of coffee prior to setting out for the matutinal bath that always preceded the work of the day, Billy asked, "By the way, Mr. Blackburn, did Kit disturb you at all last night? He was so uneasy that I had to turn out twice and go to him, and both times I found him standing at the top of the veranda steps, straining at his leash. Latterly, we always tied him up at night, switching his tail fiercely and uttering half-suppressed growls, as though he scented or heard something unusual prowling near the house. It was only by staying with him for about half an hour that I at last succeeded in quieting him down. You see, I was afraid he would awake you, and I knew how frightfully tired you must be after your long day's work at the cutter under the broiling sun. I hope no apes or other unpleasant creatures have found their way to Eden and are lurking to frighten the life out of me." "I think you need not greatly fear," said I. "All the same, there was probably a cause for Kit's uneasiness, which, by the way, did not in the least disturb me, for I never heard him, and we may as well try to discover what it was. Therefore, after breakfast, I will take the rifle and give a look around." It was, however, unnecessary to wait until after breakfast for the elucidation of the mystery, for when Billy and I reached the beach, upon which stood the nearly complete hull of the cutter, two ragged, unkempt, sunburnt scarecrows emerged from the shadow of the craft and approached me. "Mornin', mister," remarked the taller of the pair, in a would-be hearty tone of voice that nevertheless somehow suggested cringing, as did his manner. "Well, here we are again, turned up like bad pennies. Just in time, by the looks of it, to help ye finish this dandy yacht and sail her to wherever you thinks of goin'." "What!" I exclaimed, in inexpressible amazement. "Can it be possible that you are Svorenssen and Van Ryn? Why, I believed that you and all the rest of the crew of the Yorkshire Lass were drowned when she was wrecked more than a year ago." "So we was, mister, very nigh," replied Svorenssen. "There was only 3 of us, besides you and Billy, that escaped, and that was me, Dirk here, and a chap named Flemin', Pete we used to call him. When the ship struck, we was all washed overboard by the first sea as broke aboard, and naturally those of us as could swim struck out as soon as our heads rose above water. But I say, mister, ain't there no breakfast knockin' about? We haven't ate nothin' since yesterday afternoon, and we're feelin' pretty sharp set, I can tell ye." "Breakfast?" I reiterated. "Why, of course. It will be ready in about an hour's time. But you cannot come up to the house as you are. You know, by the way, were you by any chance prowling about in the neighbourhood of the house last night?" "Aye, we was," answered Svorenssen. "We landed on the beach below it, and made it out at once in the moonlight. We guessed as it was yours, and we was for rousin' you out to give us a bite o' supper, but that dog o' yours growled so vicious, and seemed so savage, that we decided to wait till this mornin'." "It was extremely fortunate for you that you did," said I. "The dog, as you call him, happens to be a leopard, and if you had persisted in your attempt to approach the house, the pair of you would assuredly have been killed. I tell you this at once, by way of warning." "The beast will have to be chained oop, else how are we goin' in and out o' the house?" demanded Van Ryn. "You will not go in and out of the house," I retorted. "There is no room for you there. Then just look at yourselves. You are as indecent in the matter of your clothing as you are filthy in your persons. Before anything else, you will have to cleanse yourselves and be clothed decently. The condition of your clothes you cannot help, I suppose, being castaways for more than a year, but you might at least have kept your bodies clean. You are disgustingly verminous, both of you, and after you have made a meal, your first business must be to get yourselves clean. You will remain here while Billy and I go up to the house and bring you down some breakfast, after which I must see what can be done to make you reasonably presentable." "All right, mister," answered Svorenssen. "We'll keep clear of the 'ouse, never fear. We don't want to be tore to pieces by no leopards, after tryin' our utmost for over a year to get to ye, and lend a hand in whatever you might be doin' to get away from this ruddy hole. We're just as anxious as you can be to get away from it, you may bet on that." "Well," said I to Billy, as we turned away to retrace our steps to the house, our bath completely forgotten, "this reappearance of Svorenssen and Van Ryn is a surprise, and not altogether an agreeable one at that. I never particularly liked either of them. They impressed me from the very beginning as being insubordinate of disposition and impatient of discipline, and I have not forgotten the character that the boatswain and Chips gave them." "How did they behave before I joined the Yorkshire lass, Billy? Had your father ever had trouble with them?" "Yes, in some ways a good deal," answered Billy. "What the boatswain and Chips said about them was quite true. They and the other two foreigners were always quarrelling with the rest of the forecastle hands. They wanted to do only just what work suited them, and not what father wanted them to do. And from what the other men said, I believe that the Dagos would have mutinied if it had not been for the chance of getting hold of and sharing the treasure." Returning to the house, Billy and I snatched a hasty meal, and then we started back for the beach, bearing with us food, 2 suits of the lightest clothing the slop chest afforded, 2 blue-striped shirts, 2 cloth caps, soap, towels, a comb, and a pair of scissors. The 2 seamen were too hungry to talk much while discussing their meal, nor did I attempt to question them just then, curbing my curiosity until a more favourable opportunity to satisfy it should present itself, and when the pair had finished eating, I marched them off to the river, where, handing them the soap and towels, I bade them strip, enter the water, and thoroughly cleanse themselves from the accumulated grime of a year's neglect. This at length done, I set them to cut each other's hair and beard, and generally render themselves as decent looking and respectable as was possible, after which I handed them their new clothes, and bade them burn their old rags. They seemed to consider me quite unreasonably particular, and grumbled a good deal at what they appeared to regard as the wholly unnecessary trouble I was imposing upon them. But I would take no denial, and when at length they realized that I intended to have my way, they surlily submitted. In the end, I believe that, in spite of themselves, they were rather glad that I had been so insistent, for when they once more stood fully clothed, their appearance was improved almost beyond recognition, and they seemed quite pleased with themselves. They were by no means so pleased, however, when, in response to a remark by one of them, I gave them to clearly understand that I would not house them in the bungalow, and that during the comparatively short period of our further stay on the group they would have to be content with the accommodation as a tent would afford. They argued hotly that, being castaways and survivors from the same shipwreck, we all stood upon a perfectly equal footing, and were alike entitled to share equally in everything. To which I replied that the bungalow, the sailing boat, and the cutter were all mine, built with my own hands out of material salved by me from the wreck, that they had not participated or helped in the slightest degree in any of the salving or building operations. Therefore, I considered they were not entitled to claim any share in the comforts or advantages arising from those operations, but that, as an act of grace, I was prepared to allow them a reasonable share of those comforts and advantages, while if they would help me to complete the cutter, make her ready for sea, and assist me on the voyage, they should be welcome to a passage in her. For a heated 5 minutes I believed I was in for very serious trouble with the two men, but in the midst of the argument, which was chiefly between Van Ryn and myself, Svorenssen intervened, drawing his companion away and saying a few hasty words that seemed to have the effect of wonderfully calming the Dutchman's excitement, and the dispute ended by their admitting, rather lamely I thought, that since I was evidently master of the situation, they supposed they must make the best of it, and accept what I chose to give them. As to helping with the completion of the cutter, they expressed themselves as only too willing to do so, since they had had more than enough of Robinson Crusoeing it. "Now," said I to them as, their toilet at length completed, we moved away from the stream, "I must again warn you both to keep well clear of the house. I have already told you that the animal which you last night mistook for a dog is a leopard. Now that you have arrived on the island, I shall be obliged to keep him tied up, but if you approach the house it will be at your peril, for if Kit sees or scents either of you, he will probably break adrift, and you will simply be torn limb from limb. He is a most ferocious creature, and will not tolerate strangers. So bear in mind what I say, and give him a wide berth." "But I wants to see the house," protested Van Ryn. "How am I to do that?" "You will have to forego that pleasure, so that's all there is about it," I replied dryly. "If the brute interferes mit me, I will kill him," threatened the Dutchman. "Will you?" said I. "Why, man, you would stand no more chance with that leopard than if you were the merest baby. But enough of this. You had better pitch your tent on the beach, close to the cutter. Go down there now, and choose a spot to suit yourselves, and Billy and I will come down later on with a sail, pole, and what other gear is necessary, and help you rig it up." By mid-afternoon the tent, consisting of the brigantine's forecourse, which I had salved, was satisfactorily rigged up, a trench dug around it to carry off water in the event of rain, and a sufficiency of rude but efficient furniture stored within it, and, somewhat to my surprise, the pair who were to occupy it expressed themselves as quite satisfied. Then, since it was too late in the day to do much work upon the cutter, I invited the seamen to give me a detailed account of how they had fared since the wreck. It was Svorenssen who undertook to tell the story, and he told it in the coarse, uncouth language of the forecastle, embellishing and emphasizing it here and there, after the manner of the shellback, by the introduction of words and phrases comprehensible enough to me, but confusing and quite unintelligible to a landsman. I shall therefore take the liberty of translating the narrative into plain, simple English for the benefit of my readers. Thus translated, it ran as follows. "It must have been about half an hour after Chips came forward with the news that you had met with an accident and had been carried down into your cabin, and the gale was still blowing as heavy as ever, when some of us on the forecastle thought we heard another sound above the shriek of the wind and the hiss of the sea, and, looking ahead, we presently saw, stretching away on both bows, as far as we could see, an unbroken line of wildly leaping breakers and flying spray. We at once hailed the quarter-deck, shouting, 'Breakers ahead, and on both bows!' But it is exceedingly doubtful whether or not we were heard, and if we had been, it would have made no difference, for before anything could be done, the ship was among the breakers, and a second later she struck, not very hard, but just sufficiently so to cant us broadside on. Then she struck again, and hung until a tremendous sea broke aboard, sweeping her decks, and doubtless washing all hands on deck overboard. At all events, that sea took me and swept me helplessly over the bows, as also Van Ryn and another man named Fleming. but I knew nothing about them until the next morning. Being a swimmer, I instinctively struck out, and I had not made more than a dozen strokes before my hand struck something that I at once seized and clung to. It proved to be a bit of topgallant bulwark, about 6 feet long, and it afforded me a most welcome support, especially as the seas were still breaking over me so furiously that it was only with the utmost difficulty I contrived to snatch a breath between whiles. But the breaking seas that came near to smothering me were also sweeping me away fast to leeward, and after a time I found myself in smoother water. The seas no longer broke over me, and the water being quite warm, I experienced no discomfort, apart from the uncertainty as to what was to eventually happen to me, and I just kept paddling along to leeward, following the run of the seas. I might have been overboard about half an hour when, clearing the salt water out of my eyes, I caught the loom of land ahead, through the darkness, the sight of which greatly cheered me, for I had no doubt of my ability to hold out until I could reach the shore, and I had the comforting conviction that where there was land there was also safety. About an hour later I found myself again among breakers, but they were a mere trifle compared with those that I had already encountered, and shortly afterward my feet touched bottom, and, abandoning the fragment of wreckage to which I had been clinging, I crawled up the beach to above high water mark, flung myself down upon the warm sand, and instantly fell asleep. When I awoke, the sun was shining brilliantly, and the gale had broken, although it was still blowing a strong breeze. I looked out to seaward, and at once sighted the wreck, about 2 miles away, dismasted and hard and fast upon the reef. Then, glancing at my surroundings, I perceived that I had landed upon a beach of fine white sand, backed by country densely wooded, with hills stretching away to north and south. The sight of the trees suggested possibilities of fruit, the thought of which reminded me that I was hungry, and I was about to make a plunge into the woods in search of something to eat, when I heard a voice hailing, and, looking in the direction from which the hail had come, I saw, to my great satisfaction, Van Ryn and Fleming, about 1/4 of a mile along the beach. Naturally, we at once joined forces, and they, being like myself hungry, we forthwith proceeded to hunt for food, speedily finding an abundance of cocoanuts that had fallen, ripe, from the trees that lined the inner edge of the beach. We ate and drank our fill of the fruit and milk of the nuts, and then, having meanwhile discussed our plans for the future, we began our quest for a practicable path inland, for the idea of camping on the beach, night after night, had few attractions for us. But the undergrowth was so dense and impenetrable that it was not until we had traversed quite a mile of the beach, under the rays of a scorching sun, that we at length found a spot where, by cutting and hacking the monkey rope and creepers with our knives, we finally succeeded in working our way into a valley, enclosed between 2 ranges of hills running practically parallel. My word, that was hot work, I assure you, Mr. Blackburn. Of course, there was no lack of shade, but on the other hand, there was no air. The atmosphere was simply stifling, and what with that and the labor of hewing a way through the dense undergrowth, much of it consisting of bushes covered with tough, sharp thorns that got hold of our clothes, and not infrequently our skins, and refused to let go, the perspiration poured from us like water and simply drenched our clothes. But the monkey rope, the creepers, the thorns, and the heat were not the worst of our troubles. The whole place was swarming with mosquitoes that hovered about us in clouds and bit us savagely in 100 places at once. And, as though these were not enough, there were myriads of small black ants that penetrated our clothing and bit us even more savagely than the mosquitoes. Luckily, we did not encounter the ants until we were very nearly through the belt of bush, or we should have been compelled to abandon our attempt. Ultimately, however, we effected the passage of the bush, and found ourselves fairly in the valley, with long dry grass, waist high, plenty of trees, big and little, but not much bush or creeper. And then we encountered potential trouble of a fresh kind, for although we were no longer attacked by ants, we too frequently heard rustlings in the long grass that we presently discovered to be caused by snakes, and we were compelled to walk very warily, lest we should perchance unwittingly tread upon one of the creatures and be bitten, perhaps fatally, as a punishment. I confess that, well, to put it plainly, I did not half like it, but what were we to do? We were searching for a cave, or shelter of some sort, that would serve us for a lodging and a place of protection in the event of a recurrence of bad weather, and we were not likely to find it by standing still. Also, we were looking for food, with a view to the future. But the question of supplies afforded us little anxiety, for banana and plantain trees were abundant in that valley, to say nothing of grapes and several other kinds of fruit. Coming to a banana tree, the fruit of which was fully ripe, we made a good meal, and then, feeling rather tired, we trampled down a smooth place in the grass, under the shade of a big tree, stretched ourselves thereon, and were soon fast asleep. Judging from the position of the sun in the heavens, it might be about 5 o'clock in the afternoon when I was awakened by somebody shaking me by the shoulder. And as I opened my eyes, I heard a voice I at once recognized as that belonging to Dirk here, who was saying, in a sort of whisper, "Hush! Don't make a noise, but just lift your head, cautious, and look." "Look where?" I returned, also in a sort of whisper, "and what am I to hush for?" "Look to your right, at Pete," which is the name by which we usually addressed Fleming, "lying fast asleep there, and see what you'll see," replied Dirk. I turned my head very cautiously and looked, and there, within less than a fathom of me, was Pete Fleming, lying flat on his back, fast asleep, with a snake coiled up like a cable right in the middle of his chest. The snake's head was resting upon the top flake of his coils, with his cold, cruel eyes gazing straight at us, and his long, black, forked tongue flickering in and out of his mouth in a most suggestively threatening manner. "What's the best thing to do?" murmured Dirk in low tones. "We must do something quickly, for if Pete awakes and stirs as much as an eyelid, the beggar will bite him, and then it will be all up with poor Pete." There was a small branch with a few twigs and a bunch of leaves on the end of it, lying on the ground within reach of my right hand. I contrived to get hold of this without disturbing the snake. Then, sitting up suddenly, I thrust the bunch of leaves on the end of the branch straight and hard at the reptile, and it vanished. That is the only way in which I can convey any idea of the rapidity with which it retreated. The next instant Pete was sitting up, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes, and demanding with many choice forecastle embellishments what I meant by my fool tricks. When we explained to him the danger that he had so narrowly escaped, he had the grace to thank me for my intervention. But we all agreed that the spot had no longer any charm for us, and that it was high time for us to resume our search for a place where we might pass the night in safety. Such a place was by no means easy to find, but ultimately, within a few minutes of sunset, we came upon a sort of shelter among some rocks, of which we at once took possession, for our need was by this time urgent, total darkness being due in about 10 minutes. Pete was strongly of opinion that, wherever our shelter might be, we ought to light a fire in front of it to scare away wild beasts, and possessing a burning glass, he took the precaution to make fire with it before the sun sank too low, and to kindle a torch with it for the purpose of lighting our fire. So, having at length found our shelter, we forthwith proceeded to gather materials, light our protective fire, and dispose of ourselves for the night. Having found a refuge of sorts, we anticipated a good night's rest, But no sooner had darkness closed down upon us than from all quarters there arose a chorus of the most terrifying sounds: roars, barks, bellowings, savage growls, grunts, shrieks. Never in my life before had I heard anything like the pandemonium that raged around us. We heard the branches of trees being broken. Great stones came rattling and crashing down the steep hillside behind us, missing our shelter by only what seemed a series of miracles. There were heavy thuds, accompanied by blood-curdling snarls that suggested the progress of life-and-death fights between ferocious beasts, and at frequent intervals we caught, through the smoke of our fire, glimpses of great eyes glaring at us. Such was our first experience of night life in the wild. At length, however, toward morning, the racket gradually quieted down, and we snatched a short spell of sleep until sunrise, when we turned out and proceeded to hunt for breakfast. Luck was with us that morning, for we had not gone far when we found the partly eaten carcass of a fine, fat deer. The creature had not been dead very long, for the blood about it was scarcely dry, and the meat was quite fresh. We were hungry and not too squeamish, so we got to work upon that deer and cut some fine steaks off a part of him that had not been touched by the thing that had killed him. And carrying the meat back to our shelter, we made up the fire and cooked ourselves a fine breakfast, finishing off with fruit as a substitute for the water that we failed to find. While partaking of breakfast, we discussed our future as castaways. With our experiences of the past night fresh in his mind, Fleming proposed a return to the beach and the construction of a raft, upon which, he suggested, we should paddle off to the wreck, with the view of giving her an overhaul, in the hope of finding something that would repay us for our trouble. But when it came to consideration of details, Dirk and I came to the conclusion that, with nothing but our sheath knives to serve as tools, the scheme was impracticable. What we might have attempted, had we known that you and Billy were alive and still aboard, is perhaps another matter. Several other schemes of an equally impractical character were suggested, only to be abandoned after discussion, until finally, failing any more satisfactory plan, we decided that if we could find a nice, comfortable cave to serve as a dwelling, we would experiment a bit upon Robinson Crusoe lines and see how we liked it. We found several caves of one sort and another that day, but the most suitable of them were already tenanted, as we could tell immediately that we put our nose inside them. Moreover, many of the tenants happened to be at home when we called, and seemed to resent our presence upon their doorsteps. Therefore, to avoid unpleasantness, we retired, in many cases rather precipitately. Ultimately, however, we came upon a cave that for some inexplicable reason was untenanted, and seemed to be everything that could reasonably be desired. It was situated high up on the side of the hill, and the entrance was so small that we were obliged to bend almost double in order to pass through. But once past the entrance, the cave widened out until its interior was as spacious as that of half a dozen forecastles knocked into one, with headroom of 10 or 12 feet. It had a beautiful, dry, soft, sandy floor, and, best of all, there was a pool of deliciously cool, sweet water at the far end of it, the first fresh water that we had found, and the air was as clean and sweet as the water. No zoological gardens odor, or taint of rotting bones, you understand. We took possession at once. Vividly remembering our experiences of the night before, our first business was to go out again and collect enough dry stuff to make a fire at the entrance to last all night. We next cut a sufficient quantity of the long, dry grass to provide each of us with a comfortable bed, and we completed our arrangements by cutting and conveying to the cave a bunch of bananas, big enough to furnish us with a supper that night and breakfast the next morning. Then, having supped, we built and lighted our fire, turned in, and slept soundly all night, notwithstanding that even in our sleep We were conscious of a repetition of all the weird sounds of the previous night. I suppose you will scarcely be anxious to hear the full details of every adventure that befell us during our sojourn in that valley, and indeed, if you did, I am afraid I could not relate them with much pretence to accuracy. Adventures enough and to spare there were, of one sort and another, but I seem to have got them all mixed up together, so that I am unable to say just exactly when any one in particular happened. The wild beasts did not very seriously trouble or interfere with us during the daytime, but the snakes more than compensated for this. They constituted a perfect terror. We grew so fearful of them at last, especially after our boots gave out, that we scarcely dared to put one foot before the other. Indeed, it was a snake that finally drove us out of the valley. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn by Harry Collingwood. Chapter 16. Svorenssen relates an interesting story. It was while we were seeking fruit that the thing happened. We had crossed the valley and plunged into the forest on the other side, Dirk and I being together while Pete was a few yards away, when suddenly, as we were passing under the boughs of a big tree, I heard a kind of plop, and at the same instant Dirk gave a yell that very nearly scared me stiff. Glancing round to ascertain the cause of the disturbance, I was horrified to see Dirk enveloped in the coils of an enormous snake, whose ugly head was poised within a few inches of my shipmate's face, the creature's forked tongue flickering in and out of its widely opened jaws. I suppose I shall never be able to explain or account for the impulse that actuated me at this horrid sight, but the fact remains that, without pausing an instant to reflect, I thrust forward my left hand and gripped the snake just behind the head, while with my right I drew my sheath knife across the reptile's throat, pretty nearly severing the head from the body at one stroke. Instantly it became a case of "Stand clear!" The snake uncoiled itself from about Dirk's body, and proceeded to fling itself about on the ground with such terrific violence that the air around us was presently full of bits of grass, broken twigs and flying leaves, while Dirk, yelling like a madman, flung himself upon the writhing body of the reptile, stabbing furiously here and there with his knife, but never touching the snake so far as I could see, while Pete came running up to ascertain what was the matter. We got Dirk away from the snake eventually, and helped him back to the cave, and when we got him there we stripped him to learn the extent of his injuries. To our great relief we found that there was very little the matter with him. He was much bruised about the body, from his waist to his shoulders, but that was all. It was, however, enough. We agreed that Robinson Crusoeing was not quite all that in our boyhood days we had believed it to be, and we resolved to return to the beach on the following morning and endeavour to swim off to the wreck. When we started to work our way back to the beach, we discovered, to our annoyance, that the path which we had cut for ourselves through the scrub had become completely overgrown again. Consequently, we had all our former work to do over again, with the ants and mosquitoes even more pertinacious in their attentions than before. Thus the afternoon was well advanced when at length we caught once more a glimpse of blue water. By that time we were so utterly fagged that we felt it would be folly to attempt a long swim under such conditions. We therefore postponed our attempt until the next day. We saw that the wreck was still on the reef, apparently in no worse condition than when we had last viewed her, and with our experiences of life ashore still fresh in our memories, we told each other what fools we had been in making no attempt to get off to her again as soon as the weather had settled after our first landing. Pete Fleming was far and away the keenest of our little party to get aboard again. He directed us to observe how high she was standing out of the water, and expressed the opinion that for that reason it might be possible for us to penetrate to her lazarette, where we should doubtless find a quantity of tinned stuff that would be infinitely more palatable than the fruit diet upon which we had so long been subsisting, and of which we were all now thoroughly tired. And he was particularly eloquent upon the subject of drink, of which he seemed confident that we should find a considerable quantity. So keen indeed was he, that he was stripped and in the water 4 or 5 minutes before Dirk or myself, and was already swimming when we too started to wade in. And then a dreadful thing happened. We were little more than ankle deep when we heard him utter an awful shriek, and saw him throw up his hands and disappear in the midst of a violent swirl of water. In an instant the terrible truth burst upon us that the poor chap had been seized by sharks, the existence of which in the lagoon we had never suspected, and on the instant Dirk and I, moved by the same impulse, turned and fled back to the beach. The incident effectually cured us of any further desire to reach the wreck, and we never again ventured to attempt any swimming until a few days ago. Dirk and I camped on the beach again that night, building a fire round our camping place as a protection against wild beasts. But some time during the night I happened to awake to discover that our fire had burned perilously low, and that some 7 or 8 great brutes were hungrily prowling round us, their eyes gleaming like green lamps, and themselves apparently waiting only until the fire had burned a little lower, or their courage had grown sufficiently to enable them to leap in and seize us. I sprang up, awakening Dirk, and together we heaped fresh brushwood upon the smouldering ashes until the flames leaped up again, and then our visitors left us. But our narrow escape brought home to us realization of the extreme danger of sleeping in exposed situations, and after breakfast on the following morning we set out to return to our cave in the valley. How long we remained there on this occasion I cannot tell you, for we soon lost count of time, but it must have been several months certainly. For some time we lived exclusively upon fruit, but later on we contrived to secure a morsel of meat now and then. Upon one occasion, I am afraid you will not believe me, but I assure you it is true, we found a young deer tangled up in the biggest and toughest spider's web you ever saw, and of course we killed and ate the little creature. That spider's web suggested to us the idea of setting traps, which we made of monkey rope, and in which we sometimes caught small game of one sort or another. We should probably have been living in that cave to this day, but for another bad scare, and in that case we should never have known that you and Billy had survived the wreck, and should have made no attempt to join you. So perhaps it is as well for all of us that we had that scare. I was by no means certain that I fully agreed with Svorenson's view of this matter, but I said nothing, and the man continued his story. There was something very curious and uncanny about that scare, though just exactly what was the nature of it I cannot tell you, for we never found the explanation of the mystery. It was a long time before we observed anything in the least degree strange connected with our surroundings. At first, not only when Pete was with us, but later, when Dirk and I returned alone, we slept soundly all night and every night. But eventually there arrived a time when, now, how am I to say it so that you will understand me? We had disturbing dreams, prompted Van Ryn. Yes, agreed Svorenson, that was it. We had disturbing dreams. At least, sometimes we thought they were dreams, while at other times we were convinced that they were real. The curious circumstance in connection with it was that the experiences began for both of us on the same night. It was our practice to build a big fire in front of the cave every night, to prevent the entrance of wild beasts while we slept, and on the night about which I am now going to speak, we did it as usual. We were never long in dropping off to sleep after we had composed ourselves for the rest of the night, and this particular night was no exception to the rule. I don't know how long I had been asleep, but it could not have been long, for our fire outside was still burning brightly, and the interior of the cave was brightly illuminated by it, when I suddenly started up, broad awake, with my hair on end, and the sweat of terror literally streaming from my every pore, for I was feeling more thoroughly scared than I had ever been before, and I was trembling like a leaf, and my teeth were chattering, although at the moment I had not the slightest notion what it was that had frightened me. Then I heard Dirk muttering to himself, and looking around I saw that he too was sitting up, looking as terrified as I felt. What is it, mate?" he stammered. "What's happened?" "That is exactly what I want to know," said he. "How come you to be awake?" "Hush!" whispered Dirk in a trembling voice. "Listen!" and he held up his hand for silence. I listened, and, believe me or not, as you please, it is the solemn truth I'm telling you, that cave was full of queer little mysterious noises, like people whispering, and the soft tread of feet all about us. I looked, and Dirk looked, but we could see nothing, yet the sounds continued, now seeming to come from the back of the cave, and then all about us. I believe I should have been far less terrified if I could have seen anything to account for the sounds, but there was nothing. Panic seized me. I sprang to my feet and rushed, shrieking, out of the cave, dashing headlong right through our fire, and coming a terrible cropper on the rough sloping ground in front of the cave. In falling I must have stunned myself, for I remember nothing more of what happened that night. But, and this I consider the most extraordinary part of the whole adventure, when I awoke next morning I found myself back in the cave again, lying upon my grass bed, with Dirk close alongside. "Ah," I commented, "quite a queer dream. What had Van Ryn to say about it? I suppose you mentioned it to him?" "I said dot it was no dream, for just what happened to Sorensen, the same thing happened to me," answered Van Ryn, speaking for himself. "Well, of course, that was very remarkable," I agreed. "Still, it could only have been a dream, since you found yourself, I understand, in the cave and on your own beds in the morning." "Ja, dot was so," assented Van Ryn. "But when we comes to overhaul ourselves, we found dot our hands and faces was badly skinned by our fall outside dot cave, and our hair and beards, as well as our clothes, was singed where we have shumped through the fire." "Indeed," said I, "that was certainly remarkable. If you are both quite sure that you did not imagine those very peculiar happenings." "If you mean about our skinned hands and faces, and our singed hair and clothes, there was no imagination about that," asserted Svorenssen. "But about the other, well, when we came to talk about it in broad daylight, we were unable to decide whether we had actually heard the sounds, or whether we had dreamed them. You see, it was not as though the thing happened once only. It happened several nights running, and at length it got upon our nerves to such an extent that we could endure it no longer. So we agreed to return to the beach and work our way along shore, on the lookout for a break in the reef, abreast of which we proposed to camp, in the hope that sooner or later a ship might come along, enter the lagoon, and take us off. "A most sensible plan," said I, "and the only thing I am surprised at is that, to a couple of sailor men like yourselves, the idea did not come much earlier." "Aye," agreed Sorensen, "it is a pity that it did not. Had it done so, we should have no doubt have discovered that you were still alive much earlier than we did, and found means to signal to you." "No doubt," said I. "Well, what happened to you after you left the cave the second time?" "The first thing," replied Svorenssen, "was that we had the misfortune to lose Pete's burning glass, which left us without the means to light a fire. That was a terrible loss, for it left us defenceless against the attacks of wild beasts at night, so that we dared not camp anywhere in the open." Dirk remembered having heard that the natives of certain countries made fire by rubbing two pieces of wood together, and we tried the same plan over and over again. Indeed, we spent the better part of several days trying to get fire in that way, but without success. We could not even raise a whiff of smoke. That was about the worst misfortune that happened to us, for without fire to protect us at night, or cook food during the day, we were continually in difficulties. But it was not long before we discovered a method of cooking after a fashion without fire. Of course you will understand that the only cooking we had to do was when we were able to obtain a morsel of meat, which was by no means every day. When we succeeded, we used to look about for a rock that had been exposed to the sun's rays for several hours, and when we had succeeded in our search, we cut our meat into thin slices and laid it upon the rock, which was hot enough to so far broil our meat as to render it quite eatable. We dare not camp out at night, even on the open beach. The beasts were certain to discover us somehow, and came prowling around, giving us not a minute's peace, and many a narrow escape we had from them. Thus we were compelled to get what sleep we could during the daytime, keep and watch, while at night we did such travelling as was possible. But that was not much, for more often than not we were driven to take refuge in trees, or retreat into the water, sitting in it up to our necks, while sharks cruising around within a few fathoms of us, and occasionally making dashes into the shallow water, and running themselves aground in their efforts to reach us. Ah, those were lively times, and no mistake, and often enough we used to tell each other that life was not worth living, yet we spared no pains to preserve it. Then, as though we had not already enough trouble, Dirk must needs fall sick of a fever of some sort, and became violently delirious. For 3 nights and 4 days I could do nothing with him. He was simply stark, staring mad. He would not permit me to approach him, but threatened me with his knife whenever he saw me. The only thing I could do was to keep him just in sight. At a pretty dance he led me, following him into the woods and all over the place, excepting into the water. Luckily for us both, he had sense enough to keep clear of that, or the sharks would assuredly have had him. But of course that sort of thing could not long continue, and towards the evening of the 4th day the poor chap collapsed, and, as luck would have it, I found a comparatively safe refuge for him among some rocks, where I looked after and attended to him until he was well enough to be up and about again. But the fatigue, anxiety, and loss of rest told upon me so severely that no sooner was Dirk able to look after himself than I fell ill, and then it was his turn to look after me for about a fortnight. Then one day, when I was beginning to pull round a bit, Dirk, who had been out foraging for food, returned to our refuge in a great state of excitement, with the intelligence that he had just seen a sailing boat alongside the wreck. The statement greatly alarmed me, for, of course, I did not believe a word of it, and my fear was that my chum was suffering a relapse, and was again experiencing delusions. But when I suggested this idea to him, he indignantly scouted the idea, repeating his statement and bidding me crawl to the opening of the shelter and see for myself if I did not believe him. I took his advice. It was, of course, the obvious thing to do, and there, to my amazement, was the boat, unmistakably enough, with her masts stepped, rigging set up, and sails stowed. What was more, after looking intently for several minutes, I had the impression that I caught glimpses of one or two people moving about on board the wreck. We watched all that day, and the next, and the next, every moment expecting to see the boat leave the wreck, and all that time we were trying desperately hard to make a fire, and thus create a smoke, so that whoever was aboard the wreck would see it, and come across to ascertain what it meant. But try as we would, we were unable to manage it. Then one day Dirk went out to look at a trap which he had set in the woods, and upon his return he reported that the boat had left the wreck and was heading along the lagoon in a northerly direction, and that there were 2 people in her, a man and a boy. So we naturally concluded that it must be you and Billy, and that you had somehow escaped drowning after all. Then I said to Van Ryn, if you saw us as distinctly as that, why did you not show yourself on the beach and wave to attract our attention? I did, replied the Dutchman. Do you think I'm such a fool as to miss a chance? But you was not looking my way, not neither of you. And though I shout and yell and run along the beach, you take no notice, but sail on until at last you sails out of sight. That is very strange, said I, for whenever I was cruising in the lagoon, I always kept an eye on the shore. Then you must have been looking out abeam, or ahead, not astern where I happened to be, declared Van Ryn. Possibly, I agreed, for I saw that the man was in a aggressively disputatious humour, and I wanted to have no words with him. Well, what happened after that? Go on with your yarns, Svorenssen. We saw you 3 or 4 times after that, resumed Svorenssen, and once you passed us so close that we easily recognised both of you. Unfortunately, we were both up a tree at the time, and unable to descend, for the reason that there was a savage brute of a wild pig that has driven us up aloft, and was waiting below for us to come down again. Of course, we shouted our loudest, and as long as there seemed any possibility that you might hear, but it was no good. I suspect it was the roar of the surf on the reef that drowned our voices, but every time we saw you, if you were not going alongside the wreck, you were steering north. So at length we came to the conclusion that you had probably rigged up some sort of shelter in that direction, and we accordingly agreed to work along shore in a northerly direction and try to find out where you had bestowed yourselves. To you, sailing along easily and comfortably in your boat, I dare say it would seem no very arduous job to work your way along a few miles of open beach. But to us two, circumstanced as we were, in a place swarming with savage brutes that seemed to be for ever lurking on the watch for us, without the means of kindling a fire as a protection, and with only our sheath knives as weapons, obliged to enter the woods at the peril of our lives to obtain food, and as often as not driven out again without the food, able to sleep only during the daytime, and very often not even then, compelled to seek shelter in trees for hours at a time, ay, and often enough for a whole day, to save our lives. It was simply, well, there are no words strong enough to describe it. Why, there were days, plenty of them, when we did not make as much as a mile of progress, when from one cause or another we did not make a fathom, much less a mile. No wonder that we were so long a time working our way round to you. Indeed, now that I look back upon the innumerable difficulties that we had to contend with, my only surprise is that we ever managed to get here at all. Then, as an appropriate climax of all our difficulties, the forest one day caught fire. Perhaps you saw the blaze, and almost the whole of the island was swept clean of every green thing. Phew! That was an experience, with a vengeance. If I had not beheld the scene with my own eyes, I could never have believed that there were so many wild creatures in all the world as we then saw. Great fierce monkeys, bigger than a man, little monkeys in thousands, leopards, wild pigs as savage as lions, deer of all sorts and sizes, and creatures the like of which we had never seen or heard of before. They all came swarming down to the beach to escape the flames, and a very curious circumstance I thought it. They were all so thoroughly terrified that none of them interfered with the others or with us, but all stood huddled together by the water's edge, bleating, squealing, roaring, howling. No, I cannot attempt to describe it. It is the kind of thing that has to be seen to be understood. Naturally, we all edged away as far as we could from the flames and the flying sparks, and eventually it began to dawn upon us, beasts as well as men, that the extreme north end of the island might possibly be spared, and we all with one accord set off in that direction. And for a little while, 24 hours or thereabout, we men did very well. The creatures all stood huddled together, trembling and making queer moaning noises, too terrified to take notice of anybody or anything. And when we needed food, all that was necessary was to lay hold of a deer, haul him out of the crowd and cut his throat, and there was all the food we required. But that condition of affairs was of course quite temporary. No sooner had the fire burned itself out than the creatures recovered their courage and turned upon each other like wild beasts. Dirk and I quickly recognised that the north end of the island was too perilous a place for us. There was therefore nothing for us but to escape from our dangerous neighbours while we could, and this could only be done by bearing away south again, which we did. There was no cause for further fear of wild beasts as we pursued our journey southward. There was not a living thing to be seen anywhere ashore. Even the birds had all vanished. That condition of affairs was of course all in our favour so far as it went, but the unfortunate part of it was that the fruit was also destroyed, so that while we could now rest undisturbed at night, our only food consisted of such raw shellfish as we could find at the margin of the beach, and we could find no fresh water wherewith to quench our thirst. For 2 days and nights we were in that predicament, our thirst being terrible, and the only relief we could obtain, and it was very partial, was to enter the sea and lie down in it for about 10 minutes, allowing the ripples to wash over us, and taking care not to go far enough in to give the sharks a chance to get at us. Then, when we felt sufficiently relieved, we staggered along for a few yards, repeating the process about 30 or 40 times a day. At length, however, we found a stream of fresh water and camped beside it. But so terrible had been our suffering from thirst that, having at length found fresh water, we could not summon the courage to leave it again. One day, however, as we were seeking shellfish on the beach, near the mouth of the stream, Dirk suddenly remarked, "Olaf, my son, just run your eye along the ridge of that hill yonder, and tell me what you see." I did so, and presently saw what had attracted his attention. There was a little patch of green that looked as though it might be trees, while all below it was black where the fire had been. "It certainly looks like a clump of trees," said I, "and where there are trees there will probably also be fruit. Let us take a walk up there and investigate." "And what about leaving this fresh water?" asked Dirk. "No need to do that," said I. "The stream comes down from that direction, and we can probably follow it for a good part of the way. Surely it is worth while to risk it." So we started, following the course of the stream until we arrived very near to our destination, and when that was reached we found it to be a nice little patch of forest, rising to the top of the hill and dipping down on the other side of it for a distance of about 2 miles. And the reason why it had not been burnt with the rest was because it stood on the lee side of a lake big enough to cut off the flames from that little patch. There were plenty of birds there, and when we proceeded to investigate, we soon found that there were animals also, small monkeys, creatures very like hares but with short ears, a few deer, but nothing dangerous so far as we could discover, and there was an abundance of fruit of several kinds also. We therefore quickly determined to settle down there and rest a bit before going any farther. There was a great patch of reeds along the western end of the lake, and here thousands of wild ducks used to settle every night, and we soon found that it was an easy matter to get a few by simply waiting for them among the reeds and catching them as they swam past. We built ourselves a hut of wattles, thatched with palm leaves, that kept us dry and comfortable when it rained. So happy and easy in our minds were we, that we almost forgot your existence, and when we happened to remember, we used to say to each other, "Never mind, we are every bit as comfortable as they are. We will stop on here a bit longer." And so we did, deferring our departure day after day and week after week, until finally the ducks grew shy of us, and the other creatures seemed to recognise our traps and avoid them, so that at length the time came when we were pretty hard put to make a living. Then too we began to feel lonesome and get snappy and short-tempered with each other, and to dream and think and talk about home and its comforts, until we grew thoroughly dissatisfied with the life we were living. And one day, after we had had one of our now frequent quarrels, I said to Dirk, "Look here, mate, we appear to have quite forgotten those other two. Do you think a man of brains, like Mr. Blackburn, is going to settle down and be satisfied to pass the remainder of his life among a group of desert islands like these? Because if you do, I don't. Just consider the facts. There he is, and the boy, and you may safely bet that, whatever else they may have done, or left undone, they will have taken care to save the treasure that we found aboard that old galleon. And what good will it do them so long as they remain here? No good at all. Therefore I think we may take it for granted that he will set his wits to work to get away from here by hook or by crook, taking the treasure with them. And then where do we come in, and what becomes of our share of it? Let us cut adrift from this spot, which anyhow is of no further use to us, and join them, and when they go we will go with them and take our share of the treasure." Dirk quite saw the force of my reasoning, eagerly agreed to my proposal, so we made a start there and then, and here we are. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn by Harry Collingwood. Chapter 17. Is Trouble Brewing? Exactly, I concurred. Here you are. But how did you know where Billy and I had located ourselves, and how did you contrive to make your way here from the southern end of West Island? West Island, is that the name of the place? Oh, we managed pretty well, returned Svorensen. From the ridge of the hill where the forest was all burned away, we were able to get a very fair idea of the geography of the group in general. We counted 6 islands in addition to the one we were already on, and we observed that the one to the eastward of us was, like our own, fire-swept. Also that at one point it was separated from our island by a channel only about half a mile wide. To the northward of that island we saw another, with small groups of trees dotted about here and there upon it, while the remainder of its surface appeared to be covered with cornfields or something similar. So it is not to be wondered at if we jumped to the conclusion that we should find you established there. So we made a start by heading for the narrowest part of the channel between our own island and the next one, carrying with us as much fruit as we could handle, for we knew not when or where we should find more. Upon reaching the channel, the question that confronted us was, how are we going to get across? We could see but one way, and that was to swim it. But what about sharks? We had already lost one of our number through them, and we had no desire that a similar fate should befall either of us. Therefore we camped alongside that channel 2 days, and while one of us foraged for food, the other just sat and intently watched the water. And when the evening of the second day arrived without disclosing any sign of sharks in the channel, we agreed to risk the passage. So we stripped off our clothes, or what remained of them, made them into a bundle, secured them upon our heads, and waded in. We got across safely, and were lucky enough to land just where a little stream of fresh water came down from the hill that rose in the middle of the island. We camped alongside the stream that night, and made our supper of melons and ground nuts that had grown since the passage of the fire over the land. On the following day we proceeded inland, following the course of the stream and heading toward the top of the hill, from which we hoped to obtain a little further knowledge of the geography of the group and also, it might be, some more definite information as to your own whereabouts. And we were successful in both particulars, for while we were on the top of that hill we saw your sailing boat coming round the eastern end of the island across the channel northward of us. Watching you, we saw you land on that island, stay there a while, and then sail away again in a northeasterly direction. Upon seeing this, Dirk and I came to the conclusion that the proper thing for us to do would be to descend to the beach, and there await your next appearance, when we would signal you. We had already detected a little stream flowing down the hillside and discharging into the channel, quite near the spot where we decided to await your reappearance, so we followed it down to the water's edge, where we camped. Then that same evening your boat again hove in sight, and we saw you land a party of niggers just opposite where we were watching, having done which you again made sail to the northward and eastward, which led us to the conclusion that after all you had not settled upon that cultivated island, as we had at first supposed, but somewhere else. Of course we showed ourselves upon the beach, and hailed, but the channel was too wide for our voices to carry across, and probably you never looked in our direction, so we failed to attract your attention. But we knew now that you were still on the group, and that we were on your track, so we did not trouble overmuch. Then, before your boat had passed out of sight, and while we were still watching, we saw a nigger paddling across the channel from the island you had touched at to the one that we were upon. He was heading to land at a spot rather more than a mile to the eastward of where we were, so we got back into the young growth that had sprung up after the fire, and pushed along toward the spot for which he was making. We arrived a few minutes before he did, and, crouching down, we saw him haul up his tub of a canoe on the beach, and make his way inland. We allowed him to get well away from the beach, and then we crept down to the canoe, launched her, and proceeded to paddle in the track of your boat. It fell dark almost before we had got fairly under way, but there was a fine moon, so it did not greatly matter. We paddled down the channel and across it to the point round which you had recently vanished. A good 8 miles we reckoned it to be, and hot work it was for 2 men who had been on short commons for more than a month. But we forgot all about that when, upon rounding the point, we saw, at a distance of not more than 5 or 6 miles, a light, and we knew that now you could not be very far away, while we were in possession of the means to reach you. But it was a tough job to get that little tub of the niggers along when once we had rounded the point, for at once we felt the full strength of the easterly breeze, and it and the popple it raised were together just as much as we could barely stem. It must have taken us hours to get across that 5 or 6 miles of water, and long before we landed you had put all lights out, and turned in. But there was the house, plain enough to be seen in the bright moonlight, so we headed straight for it, and landed at last on the beach just below. "And what became of the punt that you stole from that unfortunate native?" I demanded. "Why, I reckon she's still there on the beach where we left her," was the reply. "Still there!" I exclaimed. "Why, yes, I suppose she is. This must be looked to at once. Billy, take this man, Van Ryn, with you, and get him to show you where they left the punt. Then you and he will paddle her round to the cove here, and make her fast astern of the sailing-boat. Then get the sailing-boat under way, and Van Ryn will point out to you the spot on Apes Island from which he and Svorenssen took her." "Not me, mister, don't you think it!" suddenly stormed the Dutchman. "You're not my skipper now, and I don't take orders from you or anybody else. They're all equal now." "Are we?" said I, slipping my hand into my jacket pocket. "That's where you are making a big mistake, my man. I mean to be just as much skipper here as I was aboard the Yorkshire Lass. And if you men wish to share in the comforts of life that I am able to give you, and to go home with me when I go, you will have to submit to discipline and obey my orders." "Oh, we'll see about that," interrupted Van Ryn, springing to his feet. "Olaf, mein son, have we come all this way from over yonder to be ordered about mit this man? Let's show him dat we mean to do as we likes here. Come on." And, whipping out the remains of his sheath-knife, he gathered himself together for a spring upon me, with one eye on Svorenssen meanwhile, in full expectation that the latter would back him up. But I was fully prepared. There had been, from the moment when I first encountered these two men, early that morning, a certain truculence of speech and demeanor that warned me against trusting them too implicitly, and I had been on my guard with them all day. So now, as the Dutchman sprang to his feet, I sprang to mine, and, leaping back from them, out of arm's reach, I whipped out the revolver that I had been carrying all day in my jacket pocket, and shouted, "Hands up, both of you! Don't so much as think of trying conclusions with me, for if either of you advance a single step, I shoot to kill. I remember the reputation you two men, and you especially, Van Ryn, earned for yourselves aboard the brigantine. You were perpetually instigating trouble. But don't for a moment imagine that you will be permitted to make trouble here, for I simply won't have it. At the first hint of anything of that sort I'll hand you over to my friends, the natives of yonder island, and ask them to take charge of you. Indeed, I believe it would only be an act of ordinary prudence to turn you over to them at once." "No, no, mister," interposed Svorenssen hurriedly. "Don't think of it. There ain't going to be any trouble, I assure ye. Don't take any notice of what Dirk says, mister. His bark's always a lot worse than his bite. He don't mean a half nor a quarter of what he says. Sit down, you thundering fool, and put away that knife of yours," he continued, turning suddenly upon the Dutchman and forcing him back on the packing-case upon which they had both been sitting, and seating himself beside him. Then he leaned over his companion and began whispering hurriedly and excitedly in his ear. "Stop that, Svorenssen!" I exclaimed. "If you have any advice to give that man, speak it aloud so that I may hear. If it is good advice, there is no need to whisper it." "All right, mister," returned the Finn. "I was only telling him not to make a bloomin' fool of hisself. And now, come on, Dirk, and let's do what Mr. Blackburn orders. What he says is right. He's skipper still, and we may's well recognize it first as last. You know as well as I do that we can't do nothin' without him. Come along, Billy." Thereupon the two men rose to their feet and proceeded to slouch along the shore in the direction of the spot where they had left the punt. "On second thoughts," said I, "go, you two men, and bring the punt round here to the cove, and Billy and I will come out in the sailing-boat to meet you." Svorenssen waved his hand to indicate that he understood, and the two men continued on their way, the Finn, I observed, talking very earnestly to his companion. As soon as they were out of sight, Billy and I walked down to the boat, boarded her, got under way, and worked her round to the south beach, off which we fell in with, and took the punt in tow. The breeze was blowing moderately fresh, which enabled us to make the trip to Apes Island in a trifle over 2 hours, at the end of which we found the unfortunate native, squatted on his haunches, anxiously awaiting deliverance from the former haunt of his enemies, where I perceived the young vegetation was already flourishing vigorously. We at once took the man aboard, where, during our passage across to Cliff Island, I explained to him as best I could the episode of the stolen punt, to the amazement of the two seamen, who seemed to regard as wonderful the fact that in the course of a year I had acquired a fairly fluent command of the natives' language. I observed with satisfaction that, when Bowata and a considerable company of the natives came down to the beach to greet us upon seeing our boat heading for the landing place, the two seamen looked more than a trifle uneasy, fearing perhaps that I would seize the opportunity to fulfill my threat to hand them over to the charge of the blacks, and I was not sorry to let them see, thus early, what a powerful force of auxiliaries I had behind me should they be meditating anything in the nature of an undue assertion of independence. I designedly directed the particular attention of Bowata and his followers to my new companions, explaining who and what they were, but of course the shellbacks understood nothing of what I was saying, and they made little or no attempt to conceal their relief when I at length bade farewell to the blacks and we made sail again upon our return to Eden. On the following morning I resumed work upon the cutter, and I thought that Van Ryn and Svorenssen looked somewhat disconcerted when, in accordance with my arrangement with Bowata, a party of 10 sturdy natives arrived at the shipyard about 8 a.m. in the Chinese boat I had given them, to lend us a hand as and when required. But the two seamen turned to without demur, and I soon had reason to congratulate myself upon my acquisition of them, for while Svorenssen revealed an almost professional skill in the use of carpenter's tools, the Dutchman explained that if I would cut out the cutter's sails, he would undertake to make them to my entire satisfaction. Both men did much more and far better work than I in the least anticipated, and when at length we knocked off work for the day, and I surveyed the result of that one day's work, I felt that I might now at last begin to calculate, with some approach to accuracy, the date at which our labours might be expected to come to a successful conclusion. 2 days later Van Ryn, who was working at the new sails under the shade of a tree at some distance from the shipyard, requested that, if possible, I would spare Billy to assist him, and as the request seemed reasonable I acceded to it without demur. Thereafter matters went so smoothly for a fortnight or more that, in my satisfaction at the progress we were making, I almost forgot the suspicions which the attitude and utterances of the two seamen had aroused when they so unexpectedly reappeared upon the scene. With their assistance, work upon the cutter had progressed so speedily that the planking of her was completed, the laying of her deck about half done, her mast and bowsprit finished, and her mainsail and gaff topsail sewn and in process of roping. I therefore estimated that another month would see my ambitious project complete and possibly ourselves at sea. But my complacency was somewhat disturbed when, on a certain evening, I was instructing Billy in the problem of the reduction of the sun's altitude to the meridian. I had concluded my explanation of the problem, when the boy, glancing up at me with a smile, remarked, "That chap Van Ryn is awfully inquisitive, Mr. Blackburn. He was chaffing me to-day upon the difference in my manner of speaking now from what it was when he first knew me, and I said, yes, I had to thank you for it, for you had insisted I should study and improve my education every evening since we had been cast away. Then he wanted to know all about what you had taught me, and how much I knew, and I told him that you had been teaching me arithmetic, geometry, algebra, trigonometry, geography, and navigation, and that last word surprised him, I can tell you. It was amusing to see how interested he at once became. He wanted to know just how much I knew about navigation, and he would hardly believe me when I told him that I knew enough to enable me to determine a ship's position, day or night, provided that the sky was clear and I could get a sight of certain heavenly bodies. But when I insisted that I could do all I had said, he seemed no end pleased. 'Ah,' he said, 'I must tell Svorenssen what you say. He will be glad to hear it. It was only a few nights ago that we were talking about the time when we should leave these islands, and saying what a fix we should all be in if Mr. Blackburn should meet with another accident, or fall ill while we were at sea. And so you really believe, Billy, that if such a thing should happen, you could navigate the cutter?" I said I was quite sure I could, and then the conversation dropped, but he kept harking back to it, time after time, showing that he was still thinking about it. "Yes," said I can quite believe it, and I can understand, too, his amazement at your assurance that you, a mere boy, could, if put to it, navigate the cutter, or any other craft for that matter. There is probably not one boy in 10,000 of your age, Billy, who could truthfully claim such ability. But two circumstances have been in your favor. In the first place, you are naturally a sharp, intelligent lad, with a strong predilection for study, and in the next place, there was little else for you to do on this group but learn, until we started to build the cutter. Now, Billy, what you have told me relative to Van Ryn's inquisitiveness and his cross-questioning of you has greatly interested me, for a reason which I will explain later on. Therefore, while I am not as a rule inquisitive, I will ask you to make a point of reporting to me the substance of any further conversations which the man may hold with you, and to take very particular notice of any questions he may ask you. And now let us return to the consideration of our nautical problem. At the moment it seemed strange that Billy's story should so powerfully have affected me, but the fact remains that it did. After we had turned in that night, I lay restlessly tossing upon my bed, wondering whether Van Ryn's questioning of Billy was the natural result of pure, unadulterated inquisitiveness, or whether it had a deeper significance. The conversation appeared to have arisen naturally enough. I could not detect, in the relation of it, any indication of a deliberate attempt on the part of the man to lead up to the subject of Billy's educational acquirements. What reason, indeed, could he have for doing so, apart from the lad's more refined mode of speech? The matter that most powerfully exercised me was the Dutchman's eager curiosity to discover the full extent of Billy's qualifications as a navigator. Yet, even as to this, there seemed little enough reason for uneasiness. The man had given a quite plausible reason for such curiosity, a reason that I could perfectly understand and appreciate. But I wondered whether it was the actual reason, or was there another and more sinister one at the back of his evil mind? In any case, what, I wondered, could have put the thought in the Dutchman's head that something might possibly happen to me while we were at sea? Certainly the experience had already befallen him once since the commencement of the voyage, but with men of such limited intelligence as that of Van Ryn and Svorenssen, even such an experience as that usually makes so very transitory an impression that it soon fades. Moreover, the difficulty had been surmounted, and they would naturally believe that, should it arise again, it could again be surmounted in the same way. The only reason that I could think of why such an idea should have taken so strong a hold upon the Dutchman's mind was that, under certain circumstances, the eventuality of which he had spoken might be very much more than possible, it might be inevitable. Reasoning thus, I next asked myself the question, should anything happen to me, should I, for instance, die, either aboard the cutter or before leaving the islands, how would my death affect the fortunes of those two men, Svorenssen and Van Ryn, to say nothing of that of Billy? And why should it be desired to get rid of me? Those were not difficult questions to answer. In either of the above hypothetical cases the boy would be absolutely in the power and at the mercy of the two men, and I shuddered to think of what would happen to him, with me out of the way. Svorenssen and Van Ryn were both big, powerful men, and, should they resort to violence, what could a boy do by way of resisting them? Then the cutter was now so far advanced that, at a pinch, the two seamen could complete her, launch her, and make her ready for sea without my assistance. Their escape from the group was therefore in any case assured, while, so far as the navigation of the craft was concerned, they had already wormed out of Billy the information that he was competent to undertake that. But if the two seamen were actually conspiring against me, as I now began to think was at least probable, their primary object would doubtless be to secure the whole of the treasure for themselves. They doubtless recognized that so long as I, a man as powerful as either of them, with a mind already tinctured with suspicion of them, lived, to attempt to secure more than their fair share of the treasure might be both difficult and dangerous, and possibly even result in failure. But with me effectually disposed of, the enterprise would wear a totally different aspect. They would complete the cutter, sail away in her, with the treasure on board and Billy as navigator, willing or unwilling, and upon arriving within sight of their destination they would murder the poor boy, and the rest would be easy, or so they would probably believe. Yes, knowing the men so well as I did, I felt that there was ground for suspicion of them, and I resolved that, without appearing to do so, I would henceforth keep a wary eye upon them both, and be constantly, day and night, on my guard against any act of treachery on their part. Now it was not often that Billy did anything foolish, but boys will always be boys, to the end of time I expect, and about a week after the lad's conversation with me on the subject of Van Ryn's inquisitiveness, the spirit of mischief suddenly seized him, and, just for a lark, as he subsequently admitted to me, he must needs leave the Dutchman upon some pretence, run up to the house, and then pay us a visit at the shipyard, bringing Kit with him on a leash, that he might enjoy the consternation of the natives at the sight of the leopard. It was fortunate that I spotted the pair when I did, for the beast was already beyond Billy's control and dragging the lad helplessly after him with the evident determination to interview the strangers more closely. The animal, although not yet fully grown, had developed into a magnificent specimen of his kind, as big as a mastiff and about twice as powerful. To hold him, when I hurriedly relieved Billy of his charge, taxed my strength to such an extent that I was obliged to shout to the workers to quit work and get into hiding at a safe distance. But even so, the scent of the men excited Kit to such an extent that it was only with utmost difficulty I was able to drag him back to the bungalow and safely lash him up. I was therefore not very greatly surprised when, after work was over that evening, Svorenssen approached me and said, "See here, mister, did ye happen to salve the arms chest from the wreck before she washed off the reef and foundered?" "Yes," I said. "What about it?" "Why, just this," he blustered. "Me and Dirk wants a brace of revolvers, cartridges, and a cutlash apiece out of that chest. That's what about it." "Really," said I. "A very modest request, very modestly put. Is it permissible to ask why you want those things, and in what way you purpose to use them?" "Oh, yes, certainly," was the reply. "There's no objections to you asking as many questions as you bloomin' well likes. We wants 'em to protect ourselves against that snarlin', savage leopard of yours. It ain't safe to be on the same island with the brute." "He will not interfere with you, or molest you in any way if you give him a wide berth," I retorted. "As to giving you the weapons you demand, I won't do it, so that's flat." "You won't, eh?" returned the Finn, glowering at me savagely. "Then all I can say, mister, is that me and Dirk will have to see what can be done about protectin' ourselves. I, for one, ain't going to take the risk of being tore to pieces, no, not for another day, and so I gives you warnin'." "Now, see here, Svorenssen," said I can make allowance, and do, for your very natural fear of the leopard, but, as I have already told you, the animal will not hurt either of you men if you keep clear of him. And don't let me hear any more of such talk as you have been indulging in during the last few minutes. You forget yourself, my man, and you seem to forget also that you came to this island of your own free will. I did not invite you. I did not even want you. I was doing quite well without your assistance, as I can again, if necessary. So let me have no more threats of any sort, or I shall be compelled, for peace and quietness' sake, to request my friend Bowata and his people to take charge of you. This is not the first time that you have obliged me to say this. I shall not again repeat it. Let there be no more bickering between us. The cutter is very nearly completed, and, please God, we shall soon be at sea in her and on our way back to civilization and home." The man stared at me for several seconds with, I thought, murder in his eyes. Then he turned away, remarking, "All right, mister, you're top dog now, and what you says goes, but—" I affected not to catch that final word, but proceeded to indicate to the natives the several jobs upon which I wished them to employ themselves on the morrow. But what, I wondered, was the explanation of this fresh outburst of turbulence on Svorenson's part? For fresh it was. Only once before had he displayed such insolence of manner to me, and I wondered whether, perchance, it had any connection with the suspicions that had been bred in my mind by Billy's report of the Dutchman's recent conversation with him. But, I argued, those suspicions might be wholly unfounded, and be the result of a certain unsuspected mental disorder brought about by the long series of unusual experiences through which I had passed, beginning with the destruction of the Saturn. In any case, whether my suspicions were well founded or otherwise, there could be no disputing the fact that the two seamen were turbulent, unruly, violent characters, liable at any moment to become dangerous, and therefore they must be carefully watched. As for voluntarily furnishing them with weapons, and so rendering them 10 times more dangerous than they already were, if Svorenssen really imagined I would do such a thing, he must surely have set me down for a fool. From this time forward, without appearing to do so, I maintained a close watch upon both men, noting and weighing their every word, and endeavoring to deduce from their general conduct, and especially from their demeanor toward myself, whether or not they were really hatching a plot against me. But for rather more than a week I was unable to detect anything to justify the least apprehension on my part. Of course, it was impossible for me to observe the pair when they were alone together after the day's work was done, but although Svorenssen maintained his usual surly demeanor, I attached little importance to that, for I believed it to be natural to him, while there was no doubt that both men were working steadily and well. End of chapter 17. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. Chapter 18 of The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn by Harry Collingwood. Chapter 18. A Tragic End to Our Troubles. On a certain evening some 8 or 10 days after that outburst on the part of the Finn in connection with his demand for weapons, Billy remarked to me, apropos of nothing in particular, as we sat together studying as usual, "That Dutchman is a queer chap, and no mistake, Mr. Blackburn. He will sit for hours saying never a word but, 'Billy, pass me that,' or 'Billy, take hold of this,' and then, all of a sudden, he'll begin to chatter like a parrot." "Really," said I, "and what does he chatter about?" "Oh, all sorts of things," answered Billy, "chiefly about what he and Svorenssen went through before they joined us here, and he likes to hear how we managed, too, before we settled down on Eden. Do you know, I'm beginning to think he's not such a bad sort of chap after all. He seems to admire you immensely." "Does he indeed?" I commented dryly. "In what particular way does he reveal his admiration?" "Well," said Billy, "he thinks you are perfectly wonderful every way. Wonderfully clever as a navigator, you know, clever to have been able to build the sailing boat, still more clever to have designed and very nearly built such a beautiful craft as the cutter, and most clever of all to have built this bungalow. He said that he could understand that a clever sailor like you might be able to build a boat, but he could not understand how any sailor, even you, could build such a fine house. He wanted to know how long it took us to build it, and how we set about it, whether you invented it as we went on, or whether you drew it out on paper beforehand. and when I said that you had drawn it all out before we began to build, he said that he'd dearly like to see the drawing, because it would give him some wrinkles if he should ever again be shipwrecked." "And what did you say to that?" I asked. "Well," said Billy, "you see, I thought it was perhaps his roundabout way of asking me to show him the plan. So I said I didn't know where it was, that I rather thought you had destroyed it. And when I said that, the poor chap looked so disappointed that I showed him what it was like by sketching it out on the ground with the point of a sail needle." "That is very interesting," I said. "Here is a paper and pencil. Just reproduce on it, as nearly as you can, the sketch you made on the ground." The boy took the pencil and paper, and in a few minutes completed a rough but quite accurate plan of the bungalow, showing the relative positions of the several rooms in the front and rear portions of the house. I observed also that he indicated, with scrupulous fidelity, the position of every window and door, showing the possibility of passing from any one room to any other, through the passages and the living room. "This sketch does you credit," I said. "It gives an excellent idea of the general arrangement of the house, but I really do not see how the information it affords is in the least degree likely to be of use to Van Ryn, even should he be shipwrecked a dozen times over. To speak quite frankly, I would very much rather that you had not made that sketch on the ground for his information. Do you think he understood it?" "No," confessed Billy. "I don't believe he did, for he asked all sorts of silly questions about it that he wouldn't have asked if he had understood the plan." "Ah, indeed," said I. "Do you happen to remember any of those questions?" "No, I don't think I do," replied Billy. "They were so awfully stupid that I didn't pay much attention to them. I explained that those marks," pointing to the drawing, "represented doors, yet the silly ass couldn't understand how the servants got from their room to the kitchen, nor how they brought our meals from the kitchen to the living room without going outside and walking round the house. And he couldn't understand how you and I got from our rooms to the living room without going outside." "That's too bad," said I. "It seems to reflect upon your powers of description, doesn't it, Billy?" "It does, rather," admitted the boy. "Yet I did my best to make him understand, but he didn't seem able to grasp that we were supposed to be looking down upon the bungalow, with the roof off. He persisted in thinking that we were looking square at it, and that the rooms in the rear were above those in the front of the house." "Stupid fellow," I commented. "And was the house the only thing he manifested curiosity about?" "Oh, no," answered Billy. "There were lots of other things he asked about. He wanted to know where we got Kit from, and how it is that he is so tame with us, and so savage with everybody else. He asked if we weren't afraid that some day he would turn upon us and do us an injury. He said that if he was boss he'd shoot the beast right away, and he grumbled a bit because you wouldn't give him and Svorenssen any firearms to defend themselves with, not only from the leopard but also from the natives, whom, he said, he didn't trust a little bit, and who might come across any night and massacre us all in our sleep. Then he wanted to know how we were going to get the cutter into the water when she is ready for launching. And then, let me see, oh yes, we got on about the natives again, and the apes. He said it was all very well for us who could bolt ourselves securely in the house at night, but what about him and Svorenssen if an ape should come across and surprise them in their tent some night? How were they to defend themselves without weapons of any kind? I laughed at that, and told him that there was so little likelihood of anything of that sort happening that we never closed our doors or windows, except when it rained. But he said that didn't matter, we could defend ourselves if such a thing happened, because we had plenty of arms, and they ought to have some too. He said that, what with the leopard, the apes, and the savages, life was none too safe for unarmed men like him and the Finn. Did his terror seem quite real, or do you think it was all exaggerated? I asked. Oh, no, asserted Billy with conviction. It was real enough, and it wasn't exaggerated either. He was in a regular funk. You see, he and Svorenssen had a pretty bad time, one way and another, all the time they were on West Island. But it was the apes that frightened them worst of all. Yes, I agreed. I can quite understand that, but, as an idea suggested itself to me, do you think Van Ryn suspects that you repeat these conversations of his to me?" "No, I don't think so," answered the boy. "Why should he? I don't believe such a thought ever enters his head." I did not feel by any means so sure of that as Billy seemed to be. If the man suspected that his remarks and questionings were repeated to me, his assumption of extreme stupidity might be explained as designed to disarm any suspicion aroused in my mind by the queer character of some of his questions. Take those relating to the arrangement of the house, for example. The pretense that the information would be valuable to him, should he ever again be cast away, was altogether too puerile for consideration. He required the information, and very cleverly extracted it from the unsuspecting Billy, too, for some entirely different reason. But what was that reason, I wondered? I was not long kept wondering. The second night after the above recorded conversation between Billy and myself brought with it the threat of a change of weather. It had been exceptionally hot all day, and less wind than usual, and there was a languorous quality in the atmosphere that seemed to portend thunder, a portent that was strengthened toward nightfall when the wind died away to the merest zephyr, while a great bank of heavy, lowering cloud piled itself up slowly along the eastern horizon, so that the rising full moon had no chance to show herself. As the evening progressed, what little air of wind there was died completely away, and we were left, with all doors and windows flung wide open, gasping for breath, and sweltering as in a Turkish bath. I endured it as long as I could, and then, tossing aside the book I was attempting to read, announced my determination to go down to the cove and have a swim. Billy declared that he would like a swim too, if he could take a header off the veranda into deep water. But as to walking down to the cove in that heat, no. Much as he would enjoy a dip, he wasn't prepared to undergo that amount of exertion to get it. As the gathering storm seemed unlikely to break suddenly, I did not unduly hurry over my dip, but remained in the water about an hour, emerging at last delightfully cool and quite ready for bed. Upon my return to the house, I found Billy still up and poring over a book, but he confessed to feeling sleepy, upon which I ordered the boy off to bed forthwith and, extinguishing the lamp in the living room, retired to my own apartment and straightway turned in, being quickly lulled to sleep by the sound of pouring rain that began just as I stretched myself upon my bed. It seemed as though I had only just fallen asleep when I awoke with startling suddenness. The rain was pelting down on the roof in torrents, making quite noise enough to account for my sudden awakening, through which I could just hear poor Kit whining and fidgeting restlessly under the veranda, outside my French window. Imagining that it was these combined sounds that had awakened me, I rose, thinking, "I must fetch that animal indoors. I expect the poor beggar is getting pretty wet, hence his restlessness." One of the doors of my room opened into the living room, while the other gave on to the veranda, both of them being wide open. As I passed through the latter, a vivid flash of lightning revealed the rain coming straight down in sheets and rebounding in glittering spray off the already streaming earth, with Kit straining at his leash, which Billy had made fast as usual to one of the veranda posts. The beast had withdrawn himself as far under the veranda as his leash would permit, and he did not appear to be very wet, but he seemed anxious to enjoy the more complete shelter of the living room, so I stepped out and cast him adrift. To my amazement, the instant that I released him from his leash, he tore himself away from my hold upon his collar and, with a savage snarl, bounded through the living room door. The next instant there issued from the interior of the room a yell of consternation, immediately followed by a shriek of terror, the fall of a heavy body on the floor, screams, execrations, and the dreadful sound of Kit worrying somebody or something. And before I could draw another breath, the figure of a yelling, screaming, frantic man dashed from the room, cleared the veranda steps at a bound, landed heavily on the ground some 5 feet below, and, still screaming, disappeared through the curtain of pouring rain. But the sounds from the living room still continued with increasing violence, augmented now by cries from Billy, whose form I dimly descried outlined against the dark background of the open door, and a perception of what had happened and was still happening leapt to my brain with sudden enlightenment. "Bring a light, Billy, quick!" I shouted as I sprang through into the living room and, instinctively avoiding the table that stood in the middle of the room, flung myself upon the struggling group on the floor. My hands at once came into contact with Kit's hairy hide, and slid along it until they closed upon the collar round his neck, when, exerting all my strength, I dragged the beast, still savagely snarling and resisting, off the writhing and groaning form at my feet. Somehow, to this day I know not how, I managed to drag the fiercely struggling creature out of the room and back to the veranda, where I securely tied him up again. Then I returned to the living room as Billy entered it with a lighted lamp. I took the lamp from him and said, "Light the lamp in my room, boy, and then lend me a hand to put this man on my bed." I next turned to the writhing, groaning figure on the floor, and saw that, as I had already surmised, it was that of Svorenssen. He was dressed only in shirt and trousers, both of which, rain-sodden and drenched with blood, were torn to rags by the teeth and claws of the leopard, which was still raving outside and doing his utmost to break adrift from his moorings. The man's injuries, especially about the throat, shoulders, arms, and chest, were shocking, and I felt that, with the limited appliances at our command, there was but very small hope of saving his life. He still grasped in his right hand a formidable bludgeon, and a similar weapon lay on the floor near him. I had only time to take in these details when Billy returned, and between us we contrived to half carry, half drag the writhing and groaning Finn into my room and deposit him on my bed. I then sent Billy to the natives' room, the occupants of which had been roused by the disturbance, bidding him set them to work providing warm water and such other matters as I thought I might require. Guided by the book of instructions attached to the medicine chest, I did the best I could for the injured man, but his wounds were of so ghastly a nature, and his suffering so acute, that I recognized from the very outset, not only that it was impossible he should recover, but that death must ensue in a very few hours. And it was dreadful to sit there by his side, listening to his moans, liberally interspersed with curses of the leopard, of me, and not infrequently of mankind in general, and to reflect that that flood of blasphemy was issuing from the lips of a man hovering on the brink of eternity. At length I could endure it no longer, and I said to him, rather sharply, I am afraid, "Stop that blasphemy, Svorenssen, for pity's sake, and rather turn your thoughts to prayer, if you know how to pray. I fear that your life has been a deplorably misspent one, and it can last but a few hours longer. Before tomorrow's sun sets you will be face to face with God. Therefore I urge you to devote the few remaining hours at your disposal to making your peace with him, instead of cursing those who have never knowingly wronged you." "What do you mean?" he gaspingly demanded. "I ain't going to die, am I?" "Yes," I said, "you are, and it is well that you should know it. Therefore forget all your wrongs, real or imaginary, and—" But here I was interrupted by an outburst of such vile and savage profanity that it literally rendered me speechless. It lasted, I suppose, fully 10 minutes, and left its utterer gasping and in a state of collapse. I administered stimulant, and at length the color came slowly back to the sufferer's cheeks and lips, and he opened his eyes. For several minutes he lay there gazing up at me steadfastly, questioningly. Then he muttered, "Thank ye, mister. If it hadn't been for you I'd have slipped my cable that time. And so you think I'm going to die? Well, I'm beginning to think so myself now. My God, it's awful to think that a few hours more and I shall be face to face with my Maker, and being called to account for a whole lifetime of wickedness, and there's no way out." "Oh, but there is," I said eagerly, and thereupon I began to expound, with all the earnestness at my command, and as lucidly as I could, the wonderful story of man's redemption. I got my Bible and read passage after passage suited to the dying man's needs, until the expression of terror and anxiety gradually faded from his features, and ultimately his eyes closed and he seemed to fall asleep. Then the day dawned, and Billy, entering softly, took my place as watcher while I snatched a brief hour or two of sleep on his bed. I was aroused by the clatter of crockery in the living room, where the native women were making ready to serve breakfast, for even when the shadow of death hovers over a house its inmates must needs eat and drink, and then one of the natives, who every day came over to help with the work on the cutter, brought the news that the sailing boat had disappeared, the inference being that Van Ryn had taken her. Nevertheless, I gave orders that Eden should be thoroughly searched for him, but he was never found, nor was the boat, and that was the end of him so far as we were concerned, for we never again heard of him. When breakfast was ready, I tiptoed to the door of my bedroom and beckoned Billy, who crept softly out, closing the door behind him. "He is asleep again now," the boy whispered, "but he is dying in peace, and he wants to see you, Mr. Blackburn, before he passes away, that he may repeat to you the terrible confession that he has made to me." We took breakfast in silence, for our minds were full of thoughts too deep for utterance, and when we had finished I resumed my post beside the dying man's bed. Svorenssen was still asleep, the sleep of utter exhaustion, but he was very uneasy, and moaning occasionally. About half an hour later, however, he awoke, and, after I had again given him a stimulant, he stammered and gasped the confession he desired to make. There is no need to repeat it here word for word. In substance, it was to the effect that Van Ryn had proposed, and he had agreed, that they two, obtaining entry through the back of the house, should murder me, in my sleep if possible, arm themselves from the arms-chest, and thereafter impose their will upon poor Billy. The cutter was to be completed and launched, the treasure shipped aboard her, and the conspirators, with Billy as forced navigator, were to make their way to some civilized port, arrived in sight of which, Billy was to be knocked on the head and hove overboard, exactly as I had suspected, while the two men were to divide the treasure equally between them. It was a dreadful confession for a man to make, and I found it bitterly hard to utter the words of forgiveness that were so piteously pleaded for, but I forced myself to do so at last, and shortly after noon of that day the man, happy now and, I believe, at peace with his Maker, passed away. We buried his body an hour or two later. With the death of one, and the disappearance of the other of the two men who had come into our lives, only to act as a disturbing element from almost the first moment of our acquaintance with them, all my worries and anxieties passed away like the memory of an evil dream. And upon the day following that of Svorensen's death, I turned with renewed zest to the completion of the cutter. The hull was by this time practically finished. Her deck was laid, her companion and tiny self-emptying cockpit completed, and all that was now needed was to run a low bulwark around her, rig and step the completed mast and bowsprit, bend the sails, ballast and launch her, get the stores, water, and treasure aboard, and up anchor and away. Taken as it stands, that list of work still remaining to be done looks simple enough, yet it took me a full month to complete it, for the greater part of it was of so technical a character that the natives were of little assistance to me, and I had to do most of it with my own hands. Also I found that Van Ryn had by no means completed the task he had undertaken to perform. The two topsails, square header and jib header, still needed roping, as did the jib, and that work cost me several days' labor to complete to my satisfaction. Then there were the launching ways and the cradle to be built, and this task taxed my ingenuity to its utmost limit, but at length all was done, except the actual launching of the boat. The finishing touches to my final preparations were completed too late in the afternoon for us to do anything more that day. Immediately after breakfast on the following morning, therefore, Billy and I climbed aboard the cutter, hoisted the Yorkshire Lass's ensign to her topmast head, suspended a bottle of wine, one of the very few that we had left, from her stem head, and then, leaving Billy aboard, I descended to the ground, removing the ladder by which we had ascended. The wedging up having already been accomplished, I next took a maul and, shouting to Billy to stand by, proceeded to knock away the spur shores. There was now a moment's hesitation on the part of the cutter, of which I took advantage to jump clear, and then she began to move, slowly at first, but with rapidly increasing velocity, while I dashed the bottle of wine against the craft's cutwater, and named her the Dolphin, in accordance with Billy's earnestly expressed wish. 2 seconds later the craft took the water, plunging deeply with the foam brimming to her taffrail. Then, rising buoyantly, she shot far out toward the middle of the cove until, in obedience to my hail, Billy let go her anchor and brought her up. I then saw that I had underestimated the amount of ballast required, and that she needed about half a ton more, and a slight readjustment of it to put her in correct trim. That, however, was an error that could be easily rectified, and meanwhile I was highly gratified by the graceful appearance she presented, now that she was afloat. Next in order came a cold collation that I had caused to be prepared for the delectation of Bowata and his petty chiefs, the whole of whom I had invited over to Eden to witness the launch, and, Billy having been brought ashore in the islander's boat, we forthwith fell to, all hands doing full justice to the feast. At its conclusion I formally presented the bungalow and all that we were leaving in it to Bowata, with a strict injunction to him and his to show the utmost kindness to any shipwrecked persons who might hereafter be so unfortunate as to be cast away on the group, an injunction which they all promised to obey most faithfully. Then followed our mutual farewells, to the accompaniment of much howling and weeping on the part of our black friends, after which the remainder of the day was devoted to the completion of the ballasting of the cutter and its correct adjustment. There was but one other duty now to be done before we started for home, and that was the disposal of Kit, the leopard. Since the night when he so fearfully mauled Svorenssen, the nature of the beast had undergone a material change for the worse. He had developed an uncertainty and ferocity of temper that rendered him distinctly unsafe and altogether unsuitable as a pet for anyone. With grief and many tears poor Billy was obliged to admit that such was the case. Therefore it was at length agreed that he should be transported to West Island, where he could hurt no one, and where he would find ample prey for his sustenance. Accordingly, on the following morning we weighed anchor and bade a final good-bye to our Pacific Eden, sailing through the East and North Island channels to West Island, where, without mishap, we landed Kit and turned him adrift to shift for himself, not by any means without regret, for the beast had stood us in good stead on one memorable occasion. Then, sailing up Northwest Channel, we entered the lagoon, and, heading to the northward, passed through the wide gap in the reef, abreast of Shark Bay, and once more found ourselves riding buoyantly on the long swell of the open Pacific. Of course I had long ago given most careful consideration to the question of where I should steer for, in the event of the cutter's completion, and, after much study of the charts at my command, I had decided to shape a course for Sydney, Australia. It meant a voyage of some 2,350 miles across the open ocean in a 10-ton cutter, but I felt sure the Dolphin could do it, especially as we should have the southeast trade wind and the prospect of reasonably fine weather with us nearly all the way. Accordingly, as soon as we were fairly clear of the reef, I bore up and headed away to the southward, along the west side of the group, of which we finally lost sight about an hour before sunset. To say that our voyage was unadventurous would be untrue. On the contrary, we had many thrilling adventures and several hair-breadth escapes from destruction, but lack of space forbids more than the bare mention of them here. Let it suffice to say that, after a voyage packed with sufficiently exciting incidents, we arrived safely in Sydney Harbour on the 23rd day after our departure from the group. Arrived there, my first business was to negotiate with a firm of bankers for the exchange of some of the gold coinage, which formed part of our treasure, for a sufficient number of British sovereigns to carry both of us comfortably home; and, this done, we set about providing ourselves with outfits suitable for the voyage. It was, of course, impossible for us to keep our adventures entirely secret. A hint of them somehow got abroad, possibly from the people in the hotel at which we put up, and the enterprising reporters of the Sydney papers did the rest, one result of which was that I soon got from a local yachtsman so advantageous an offer for the Dolphin that I unhesitatingly accepted it. We spent a very pleasant fortnight in Sydney, many of its leading citizens vying with each other to show us hospitality. Finally, on a certain day in the month of April, we both embarked for England in an Orient liner, which, after a most delightful voyage, landed us in London on a glorious day in the month of May. End of chapter 18. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. End of The Strange Adventures of Eric Blackburn by Harry Collingwood.